If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 1, The Man Who Survived. As the foggiest city in the world, London's skies are grey most of the time, especially at night, when even the streetlights have very limited illumination. In this darkness, some stray cats were rummaging through a garbage can in an isolated alley, looking for food for the night. Suddenly, a dull red glow shone over the unfamiliar alley, disturbing the cats searching for food. Frightened, the cats fled in all directions, hiding where they thought they would be safe. After a few flashes of the dull red light in the sky, space twisted like a ball of crumpled paper and, with the sound of ripping cloth, a bloodied figure emerged from the void. Cough cough. "I've finally escaped," the figure stumbled twice, reached for the wall to pull himself up and looked around. The buildings around him were unfamiliar, but he had a vague sense of familiarity. "Where did I get to?" Camelot looked around at the familiar and unfamiliar buildings with confusion in his eyes. The buildings did not resemble the Temitron magic fellowship to which he belonged, nor those of any other human country, nor those of the elves, dwarves, or any other race. It was a bit like the modern architecture of the time before he was reincarnated. That's right. This is the style of architecture that existed before he transmigrated. Camelot's mouth opened slightly and he didn't know whether to cry or laugh. This isn't the right fucking time, asshole. If he hadn't been injured, he would have been able to return to his old world, but now he was severely injured and his magic power was almost dried up, so he couldn't use magic to heal himself. Damn it, why did I appear in this world without magic at this time? Camelot slowly slid against the wall and sat down on the floor, feeling a bit desperate. Camelot was a transmigrator, and the reason for transmigration is very common, that is, he was seriously ill, and died on the operating table. Then, when he reopened his eyes, he found himself reborn as a baby in a world of swords and magic. He felt very happy. Not only did he get to live another life, but he also had access to magic that previously existed only in fantasy, which was incredible in every way. Camelot was born in the Duchy of Lancaster, which is part of the magical Commonwealth of Temitron. The Magica Federation of Temitron was a joint force made up of several small nations, each of which is not led by a king, but by a wizard who has been given the title of Grand Wizard. These wizards leading the small nations are composed of the Magical Council, the true authority of the Magical Federation of Temitron. Under this social system, the children of the Magical Federation of Temitron have been accustomed to a magical education from an early age, even though Camelot is a commoner born in the countryside. Although he did not have the system that exists in many novels, nor did he have a special physique or a golden finger, his adult mind and his knowledge that he had acquired on Earth made Camelot a known magical prodigy at a very young age. After making a name for himself, Camelot was soon enrolled in the Duchy of Lancaster's National School of Magic as a promising magical apprentice. Camelot took the opportunity to learn more about magic at the school and attained the 3rd rank at an early age. There are 7 levels of sorcery in the Temitron Magic Federation, with the exception of the first apprentice and the last, the ungraded tutor, are divided into 1 to 5th rank from lowest to highest. Mages of 3rd rank in the Temitron Magical Federation can already obtain a great fief and a noble title. But after reaching the 3rd rank, Camelot seemed to have reached a limit, as he had no system and was not descended from a good bloodline, and as a commoner mage, reaching the 3rd rank was enough to make him a commoner icon. However, Camelot was not willing to let go of his inexplicable transmigrant pride, nor his obsession with magic, and he did not let go of his noble title or his domain. Aside from the occasional task assigned by the Magical Federation and obtaining funds and research materials, Camelot remained in his domain to study magic. Thanks to his hard work, Camelot was able to reach the 5th rank, and as a result, he joined the Magical Council of the Magical Federation of Temitron. However, by then he was already over 200 years old. The power of magic allowed Camelot to live longer than ordinary people, and even at 200 he still looks middle-aged, but he was nearing the end of his life expectancy. At the end of his life, Camelot did not fear death, but he still wanted to go further and see what it would be like to become a great wizard. However, becoming a grand mage was not a matter of hard work, but required more than just talent, and Camelot's own magical talent was only good enough to be a 5th rank mage, which was a surprise to the world, but it was almost impossible to become a grand mage. Not to mention the fact that Camelot did not have many years left to live. In the 200 years he had been a wizard, Camelot had tried to improve his talent in various ways, it had worked, but not enough for him to reach the level of Grand Wizard in a few years. Reluctantly, he delved into libraries, sifting through all sorts of secrets that he didn't know if they were true or false, and finally found an account of an elven treasure that he could confirm existed and would help him. The information gathered from the many secrets was not detailed or accurate, and after eliminating some of the information that seemed to be made up and conflicting, all Camelot could confirm was that there was an elven treasure made from a fragment of the world tree that had the ability to increase magical affinity significantly. But what this treasure looked like, what it was called and how it was used could not be confirmed in the information that had been gathered, except that it emitted a soft white light that gave a sense of closeness. With time running out, Camelot took this unknown elven treasure as a last resort, selling all his possessions and buying expensive magical equipment, as well as a large number of high-grade invisibility rings, space teleportation scrolls, defensive amulets, and other magical items. After this, he found a way to join a group of visitors from the Temitron Magical Federation, followed them to the Elven capital and found a way to sneak into the Elven treasury. But when Camelot entered the Elven treasury, he was also discovered by his security. The Elven guards quickly arrived, and Camelot frantically threw all sorts of magical props to keep them at bay as he searched the vault for the mysterious treasure. Finally, when he could stand it no longer, he found a completely transparent and irregular crystal with a soft white light that made him wish he was near it. Already badly wounded, Camelot grabbed the stone and, straining all his spatial dexterity in the magical realm of the elves, opened a hole in the elves' treasure and dived into it. He didn't expect to be able to teleport to Earth, but he did. Meow. A cat's meow from deep in the alleyway brought Camelot, who had already begun to doze off, back to her senses with a start. Damn it, I almost died like that. Having come this far, of course, Camelot wasn't about to give up, and he hastily summoned his remaining magical power to unleash a healing spell that was no better than that of a wizard's apprentice. The healing spell, though cumbersome, restored some energy to the dying Camelot, and he began trying to draw magic from the air, but he didn't expect him to actually sense the existence of magical power. But compared to the world he had transmigrated to, magic in this world was relatively slow and of lesser quality, and his current condition would not allow him to absorb enough magic to cast a healing spell to get him out of danger. Looks like I can only bet, Camelot said and, trembling, he pulled the elven treasure he had traded his entire fortune and life for from his tunic, and with the small amount of magic he had just obtained, he poured it into the elven treasure. As he poured the magic, a small white light shone inside the stone, which had lost its glow, and although it was very faint, it gave Camelot a feeling of warmth like a mother's embrace, making his body, which had been cold from the loss of blood, feel much better. Hopefully, Camelot frantically drew on the magic around him and poured it into the crystal in his hand. As the magic slowly entered, Camelot received information from the crystal itself. It was made from a fragment of the world tree, and had a significant increase in magical affinity, as well as an increase in longevity, physical strength, wisdom, and a host of other benefits. However, most of them were for natural magic, while other magic systems received improvements. They were not much stronger than the methods he used in the past. In other words, even if Camelot managed to merge the fragment of the world tree, he could not become a great wizard, because the highest level of nature magic has its own title, Great Druid. Forget it, it's just a change of magic system, it would be nice to be able to continue living. Camelot had no choice but to console himself, but the spells of druids were different from those of normal mages, as they had a range of normal spells, but most of the time they awakened different spells based on their affinity with the animals and plants of nature. As Camelot poured in more and more magic, the white light from the shard of the world tree became brighter and brighter, and as the brightness grew, the crystal gradually lost its solidity and became a white ball of light floating in Camelot's palm. At this point, Camelot was already at his limit, and although the light in his hand was getting brighter and brighter, he could feel his vision getting dimmer and heavier, but he was desperate and could only stare at the white light in his right hand, which, according to the information provided by the fragment of the world tree, had to be swallowed only after it had been reduced to a round pearl of light. Just when Camelot felt that he was about to be unable to hold on, the ball of light in his hand suddenly swelled violently, and then quickly shrunk inward, quickly forming a round bead with a soft white light. Ha 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 ha. If you don't die, you'll be blessed later. Camelot was glad that he survived, and with his last strength, he held the bead in his hand and put it into his mouth. At that moment, a small grey shadow came out of nowhere, passing in front of Camelot's blurred vision and taking the glowing white bead in his hand with it. Meow. Before Camelot lost consciousness, all he heard was a cat's meow. Chapter 2, The Fish Disappears Silently. It was a morning like any other. The sky over London was as hazy as ever. Mr. Evans, who lives on Christchurch Road, opened his store at 7 o'clock in the morning, as usual. Mr. Evans' store is one of the most common restaurants in England, selling only fish and chips. Although not a well-known establishment, Mr. Evans' store is well known in this part of Christchurch Road and is often visited by people who work and do not have time to cook. Unlike most fish and chip stores, Mr. Evans does not use cod as the main ingredient in his chips, but rather the larger albacore tuna. And the reason Mr. Evans chose albacore tuna? That is, of course, because albacore tuna is cheaper. As for the taste, the fried fish he sells is cheap and in large quantities. Does it matter how it tastes? Anyway, it's the same when fried. And not to be presumptuous, but with the tongues of most of his compatriots, it's not easy to tell the difference between albacore tuna and cod. After opening the door to the store, Mr. Evans, humming an inaudible tune, headed for the kitchen and set to work on the ingredients. Although he chose the cheapest albacore tuna, Mr. Evans insisted that all the fish be alive and fresh. The albacore tuna in the kitchen had just been pulled from the old right was still alive and kicking. Grabbing a white tuna, Mr. Evans expertly tossed it onto the cutting board, where the struggling white tuna instantly collapsed and was quickly disassembled with a kitchen knife and placed neatly on a side plate. After processing a dozen albacore tuna in the same manner, Mr. Evans stopped his work, picked up the plate with the fish and prepared to coat it in flour and breadcrumbs before pan-frying it. But as soon as Mr. Evans picked up the plate, he realized something was wrong. They were lighter in weight. Having been in the business for more than a decade, Mr. Evans had a clear idea of how much fish he had cut, and the weight of the fish in his hands was clearly a little different from the amount he had cut. Strange, Mr. Evans looked around and saw that there were no fish on the floor. Had he accidentally thrown the fish in the trash with the guts and bones when he had cut it up? Scratching his hair in confusion, Mr. Evans didn't worry too much, as it looked like only 2 or 3 pieces of fish were missing, and it wasn't worth wasting time over, as the first customers would be arriving soon. This aside, Mr. Evans followed his usual procedure of frying fish and chips. Even after the customers arrived, Mr. Evans used it as a topic of conversation with the regulars. What Mr. Evans didn't expect was that today was just the beginning. As the days went on, Mr. Evans lost more and more fish, even rummaged through the trash can, but didn't throw the fish away himself. However, no matter how much care Mr. Evans put into the pieces of fish, he couldn't stop them from disappearing. He even put the plate with the fish under his nose, but it was as if the fish had grown legs of its own and disappeared in the blink of an eye. After another mysterious fish disappearance, Mr. Evans finally relented and hired John, a 7-year-old boy, from his neighbor's house, at the price of 15 cents, a huge sum, to help him see how his fish had disappeared. It was a new morning. Mr. Evans took little John to his store, where he put him in a box he had prepared, while he handled the fresh albacore tuna, as he always did. Little John hid in one of the boxes, looking at the dishes on the table through the holes in the box. At first nothing happened, but as the quantity of fish grew, a ghostly figure suddenly appeared in the cabinet over Mr. Evans' head. It was a silver-grey tabby cat. Little John couldn't tell if it was a British cat or an American cat. The kitten didn't look very old and was only the size of an adult's palm, with emerald green eyes that stared through the cracks in the cabinet at the fish on the table. The cat turned its ears, as if sensing Little John's presence, and its big green eyes turned toward the box where it was hiding, pausing there for a moment. Little John met those green eyes through the gap in the box, and his little hand covered his mouth and nose, fearing that he might accidentally disturb the kitten by making noise. Sensing that Little John wasn't going to stop, the tiger-spotted kitten withdrew his gaze and turned his attention back to the albacore tuna meat on the table. Making sure Mr. Evans wasn't paying attention to the fish, the tabby swooped down from the cabinet like a ghost, landing softly on the table without a sound. Looking at Mr. Evans, who was still engrossed in his work, the kitten quickly grabbed some of the fish on his plate, bobbed his head up twice and swallowed it without a sound, then quickly devoured almost as much fish as his body in the same manner before jumping into the cabinet, scampering across the top of it to the kitchen skylight and bursting through the gap and disappeared. It wasn't until the tiger-spotted kitten was gone that Little John jumped out of the box with excitement. "Uncle Evans! I've seen him! He's a beautiful kitten!" Little John started dancing around, describing the kitten to Mr. Evans, and pleading with him for mercy. "He doesn't eat much anyway, so don't hurt him, Uncle Evans. If you can't, I'll pay for it out of my own pocket money." Looking at the excited Little John, Mr. Evans rubbed his head in amazement, knowing that Little John had been saving for a soccer ball for so long that he had been as careful with his money as the famous old miser at the corner tailor's shop. What was the magic of the fish-thieving kitty that made John give up his favorite soccer ball? But Isn't that cat eating too much? According to Little John, he's just a kitten, so how could he eat so much? I guess the hole in the box was too small for Little John to see clearly. Mr. Evans shook his head and laughed, then patted Little John on the head and said, "Save your money for soccer ball, I can pay for this fish." And so the Evans store had another topic of conversation for the day, the mysterious grey tiger-spotted kitten that only Little John had seen. Chapter 3, Owl. It was a rarely sunny day in London, and the warmth of the sun shone on everyone, putting most people in a good mood. Dogs were roaming the streets, cats were sunbathing lazily in the trees and on the rooftops, and even owls, which are normally rare to see, were appearing in flocks, flying overhead. On Christchurch Road, Little John came running out of his house with his new soccer ball, intending to take advantage of the nice weather to have a good game with his buddies. Ah, it's Monk Strip. As he passed a mailbox, he saw a tiger-spotted kitten lying on top of it and stopped dead in his tracks. The tiger-spotted kitten was the same one he had seen stealing fish from Uncle Evans not long ago, and after Uncle Evans prepared fish for the kitten, it gradually stopped hiding and began to come into view. For some reason, the cat had a special charm, and everyone who saw it loved it, even the old miser at the tailor's shop, who fed it when he took his daughter for a walk. Even Tip Evans' store business had been greatly improved by the appearance of his cat. The only unfortunate thing was that the kitten didn't seem to be very affectionate, and no matter how much it was fed, it was never allowed to be approached, let alone petted. And according to the adults, the kitten's appetite doesn't seem to be commensurate with its size, but that's not a big deal to Little John, who, along with his friends, want nothing more than to be able to pet the proud kitten. And they named the kitten Monk Strip after a book of fairy tales. Only the little kitten never responded to the name. John held his breath and cautiously approached Monk Strip, who was lying on the mailbox, but when he got about 10 feet closer, the little tiger-spotted cat, squinting in the sun, raised his head and fixed his green eyes on John, daring him to come closer. Ah, missed again. Little John backed up 2 steps, reluctantly stomped as he saw Monk Strip lay down again, but didn't try again because he didn't want to disturb Monk Strip's rest. He had no choice but to leave with the ball in his arms and run off to find his friends. "I'll pet you someday, Monk Strip," said Little John before he left. The tiger-spotted kitten opened one eye slightly and watched Little John's distant back with a very humanized expression of disdain on his face. Stupid human. With his intelligence, the tabby kitten understood that Monk Strip was the name the human kittens had given him, but it was a long, stinky name that he didn't like at all. Besides, the tiger-spotted kitten had already given himself the name of his favorite food at the time, which in human parlance, he should call was fish. Although his favorite food now included birds and salami, the tabby kitten had no intention of changing his name. With a flick of his ears, Fish closed his eyes and continued to bask in the sun comfortably. This kind of weather is rare, so it can't be wasted. After the sun was once again hidden by the clouds in the sky, Fish slowly stood up from the mailbox, frowned and stretched, then licked his paws and rubbed his face before jumping out of the mailbox, shaking his fur, tail held high, and walking briskly to the other side of the street. Meow. When Fish walked by, the cats, who had been playing and licking their fur, came toward him, and the dogs, who had been playing, barked and wagged their tails at him. If it weren't for Fish being able to understand the dog's language, he would have thought they were provoking him. Because in the cat world, wagging the tail quickly is a tendency to attack. As for why dogs and cats are so close to him, Fish is used to it. Animal affinity, most animals will be affectionate with you. As far as Fish could remember, this strange knowledge came to him after eating a shiny bead, and since then he has somehow understood a lot of things. His intelligence had increased, his body became incredibly strong, and there have been a lot of strange changes. For example, he never increased in size. But Fish didn't care too much about these things. He ate and slept, most animals wouldn't fight him, and even the few with bad tempers couldn't beat him, so what was there to worry about? After playing with many of his kind for a while, they all dispersed. Although the influence of animal affinity makes them friendly to Fish, cats are very self-conscious creatures, so a quick greeting and a lick on the fur is all they need. They have their own things to do, like sleep, chase butterflies, wrestle with their hind legs, etc. After a long walk around the neighborhood, Fish was hungry after a good workout and sat on the roof, wagging his tail mindlessly as he thought about where he would find food later. He had already eaten fish in the morning, and the rats in the neighborhood were becoming fewer and fewer as he and his kind devoured them. The shriveled human in the tailor's shop was feeding him a good snack, but he was always trying to catch him while he ate, and it was too tiring to eat like this. A brownish-grey figure flew past Fish, which made him unconsciously lick his teeth. These guys that could fly in the sky always tasted good, but they were harder to catch. And if they went pigeon hunting in the square, there were often humans who would step in and chase their prey away. It's annoying. With his big green eyes fixed on the silhouette of the bird in the sky, Fish wagged his tail more and more. For the brownish-grey silhouette in the sky was not the usual pigeon or robin, but a much larger, plump-looking bird. Now Fish's desire to hunt intensified. How could he get his hands on one of those plump birds in the sky? Staring at the fat bird as it flew away, Fish was lost in thought. Then, little by little, a strange sensation arose in Fish's body, and a knowledge came into his mind out of nowhere. Animal tracking provides the ability to perceive the location of all animals within a given range. Wild mark leaves a mark on the animal's body, which greatly increases its range. Fish squinted. It looks like it has some food. Chapter 4, Change. Give me the change. He chased the fat bird into an unfamiliar neighborhood, and because of the animal affinity spell, even though Fish had invaded the other cat's territory, they didn't attack him, but they didn't get too close to him either, they just ignored the tabby kitten. In any case, Fish had no intention of taking over the territory of his own kind, and it only happened because he wanted to eat the fat bird. The fat bird with an envelope in its mouth flew into an ordinary-looking house. Crawling behind a flower pot, the tabby kitten was puzzled. Didn't humans deliver mail in those red mailboxes and those noisy things called cars? And the house where the fat bird came in gave Fish a funny feeling. He didn't know why, but he didn't want to go near it. After a moment of confusion, Fish decided to stay outside, but changed the ambush location to the roof of the building facing the window where the fat bird had entered. After a while, the fat bird flew out the window, but this time it did not have an envelope in its beak, but seemed to be carrying something tied to its talons. The owl then flew directly over Fish's head. Ready to go, Fish leaped forward and swiped the fat bird on the wing with his talons, while at the same time bit one of the bird's legs, knocking the owl down. The owl stumbled in the air, but with a flap of wings flew back up. Fish's weight no big deal for an owl that usually carries cargo for mages. But still, the owl struggled with its talons. The bite of the tiger-spotted kitten that suddenly attacked him was truly terrifying. Even through 2 layers of parchment, the owl felt as if its claws were about to break. Fish, who was biting at the owl's claws, wasn't having a good time either, as the big bird's strength was much greater than he expected, and his small body wasn't very convenient for knocking it out of the sky. If only it were a little bigger, Fish thought as he struggled to pull the owl's talons. While being small can be useful at times, when it comes to fighting, it's the bigger ones that have the upper hand. And then, a familiar feeling suddenly came. Shape-shifting. Change your shape to a certain extent. The moment the spell awakened, Fish understood its use. Meow. Fishy meowed excitedly, grabbed the fat bird's thighs with his claws and pulled hard, using the force to throw its body upwards. The owl was dragged up and fell back down, while the tiger-spotted kitten climbed back up over the owl. Fish's body swelled up like a balloon, and his short tiger-spotted fur grew wildly, replacing it with a long black and white striped coat, and even his face changed a little, becoming a bit more imposing. He was the largest of his species Fish had ever seen, a Maine Coon cat from North America who had moved to Christchurch Road with his owner. In his Maine cat form, Fish now stood about half a meter tall and, by sheer size alone, was slightly larger than the owl in front of him. With an enormous force of gravity, Fish stepped on the owl's back and opened his mouth wide to bite the fat bird's neck. Gah! The owl let out a high-pitched scream, and dragged by the suddenly huge cat. It fell from the sky and crashed to the ground, breaking its bones and dying within moments. Fish, who had also fallen from the sky, rolled twice on the ground and shook his head, unharmed. Fish's body had been transformed by the golden basin and was already very strong, and cats were always good at falling from heights, not to mention the fact that Fish had awakened abilities called cat glide and cat lightness, so he couldn't be hurt at this height. Taking small, graceful steps to the side of the fat dead bird, Fish picked up the owl's body and scrambled into the grass beside it. Now he had to find a safe place to enjoy his prey. Fooled! Fish spat the feathers into his mouth in frustration. The bird looked so fat, but it had a thick layer of feathers on the outside, and it didn't have much meat on its body. It wasn't even as fat as the pigeons in the square. But the meat of this bird is much tastier than that of the pigeons. And even if they had little meat, fish wouldn't let them go if he came across them in the future. After all, cats are born hunters by nature, and his instincts will lead him to attack these flying creatures. Sticking out his tongue to clean his fur, Fish deftly hopped over to a nearby wall and walked along the wall in the direction of the noise. Where is this? Fish crouched on the wall, wagging his little head and looking around, his triangular ears erect and swiveling from time to time. He seemed to have been taken by the fat bird to an unfamiliar place, where the buildings seemed taller than where he had been, and there were more of those rumbling four-wheeled monsters. After gazing for a while at the steady stream of cars and two-legged beasts moving back and forth, Fish soon accepted the fact that he was starting a new life in a new place. He's not particularly concerned about the issue of survival. Anyway, as long as there were humans, food was not a problem at all, and others of his own species posed no threat to him, so he could live anywhere, but it was a shame he had to make do with the area he had been given. Fish climbed down from the wall and began patrolling his future territory. Because of the animal affinity spell, the humans around him were no different from the previous group, always trying to get close to him. However, as always, Fish was only concerned with the food given to him by the humans, not the petting. After taking a quick look around the area, Fish got a good idea of what the area looked like, and was about to return to a tree he had been eyeing for a rest when he was startled by something in a nearby tent. It was a square wooden box with a slightly curved piece of glass on the front. It was a television. The TV was showing a documentary on animal ecology. And today, it turned out, they were showing the tiger. Chapter 5, Owl. A major crisis for the owls. Rita Skeeter, our correspondent, reports on the recent spate of missing owls in London, which has resulted in the disappearance of many wizarding letters and the disappearance of many owls from our newspaper, causing untold damage, but the incompetent Ministry of Magic has yet to find any leads. As we all know, in the period when he who must not be named has not been eliminated, he and his Death Eaters often committed crimes of intercepting owls. Does this mean that the Dark Lord's power is resurgent? In fact, there were cases of missing owls shortly after the defeat of he who must not be named. Said a member of the Ministry of Magic, who wishes to remain anonymous, someone had alerted the higher UPS, but Minister Millicent and most of the higher UPS were too immersed in the joy of victory to take it seriously. Owls are companions and friends of our wizards, and yet the senior officials at the Ministry of Magic don't seem to care about it. Now the situation is so serious that when a reporter asked a ministry official if he could find out the truth in time, he obliged by ending the interview without comment. In the Daily Prophet, a story about an owl caused a sensation in the wizarding community, especially in London. However, the initiator of such a story was waking up in a thorn tree. After waking up with a big yawn, Fish sat down on a branch and began licking his front legs, rubbing them both across his face. After giving his face a good scrubbing, Fish shook out his fur, stretched and jumped off the thorn tree. Although Fish had long ago changed his eating schedule to conform to human habits, his main time of activity was still at night. Taking light steps to the next tree, Fish straightened up, placed his two front paws on the tree trunk and began to sharpen his claws. In fact, with the shape-shifting spell, he no longer needed to sharpen his claws, but he did it out of habit. After sharpening his claws and adding numerous new scars to the unfortunate tree, Fish started the day with his tail up, patrolling the territory and seeing if he could come across any humans to get some food from. He had long since chased the fat bird called an owl away from his birthplace, and Fish had changed territories several times for the same reasons, or different reasons. Basically there was no danger for him anywhere, and the change of territory brought more new things, so Fish had gotten used to it. As Fish progressed, his body swelled and his shape and fur changed. In short, he became a half-meter-long, cheetah-furred cat. In the strange box called a television, he had seen several of his kind that were huge, but no matter how hard he tried, he could only change to a size of half a meter, and his appearance was distinctly different from that of a real tiger or lion. But this was not important to Fish, he was just playing, and half a meter was more than enough for him. After wandering around the area, Fish got a little bored. As the temperature has been dropping lately, his have been going out less often. From past experience, before long there will be a lot of icy white stuff falling from the sky, which humans call snow, and they seem to like this white stuff a lot. However, Fish and his kind don't like this weather so much, as at this time of year some of them tend to fall asleep and not wake up. Although his situation was quite special and he wasn't worried about not being able to wake up, Fish still didn't like the weather. What Fish liked best were warm, sunny days, but unfortunately there weren't many of them. Just as Fish got bored and started to chase his tail, he suddenly heard a coo in the sky. It was the call of an owl. Although owls have different calls, they have always had a distinctive and recognizable cooing sound. Fish lifted his head and saw a familiar plump figure streaking across the sky. Unconsciously, he licked his tongue, for it had been a long time since he had tasted an owl. It seems he'd been hunting too much, so the owl frequency had been reduced lately. Without hesitation, he threw a wild tag at the owl and it returned to its original form, but still half a meter in length, and chased the tagged owl into the distance. According to Fish's previous experience in owl hunting, owls were usually used by a group of strange humans dressed in robes to help them deliver letters and goods. So, they would usually fly to a certain place and then return the long way around. That's why he has become much more efficient at hunting owls over the years. All he has to do is find a place to ambush the owls on their return route. And if he came across the occasional robed human, he could easily hunt the owls by bedding down in a place close to where they lived. This time, however, the marked owl was strange, not as a messenger, but hovering over the vicinity and making occasional cooing noises. As Fish wondered, the owl seemed to tire of flying and perched on the balcony of a house, gathering its wings and resting. The opportunity was too good to pass up. Fish immediately withdrew his talons, and with forepads silently and swiftly treading the ground, he came to the corner of the wall like a ghost, and climbed up it without stopping. Spider step, he has acquired the ability to walk on walls and ceilings. Silently, Fish crouched behind the owl and approached it slowly. At the same time, his triangular ears perked up high and his eyes fixed on the owl, his pupils gradually dilated, almost filling with the green color of his eyes. Just then, the owl seemed to sense danger and turned its head almost 180 degrees, and met Fish's eyes as it crawled forward. However, at this moment, the distance between the two was enough for Fish to launch an attack. He shot out like an arrow, pouncing on the owl, knocking it off the balcony and sinking his teeth into the owl's neck. The cat and bird rolled and tumbled off the balcony. Just as Fish was about to snap the neck of his prey, he felt a sudden force of repulsion coming from the owl's body, causing him to let go and catapult himself into the air. Immediately after, the owl swelled up in front of Fish, transforming into a human dressed in a grey robe, with grey hair and beard. Bouncing off the ground, Fish adjusted his body in the air and landed safely on the ground. As the owl turned human, waved a wooden stick in his hand and shouted, "Wingardium Leviosa!" The human, who was falling rapidly, stopped abruptly in mid-air, and then landed as light as a feather, just as Fish had done with the glide skill. Chapter 6, Catboy. A ravenous beast with a dripping mouth, it is a ferocious creature, the wizard, or, who had regained his human form, grimaced as he covered his bleeding neck. Is this the cat responsible for the mass disappearance of owls in London, Dumbledore? I can't give you an exact answer to that, or, an old man, white-haired and dressed in a dark blue robe, emerged from the shadows. His blue eyes peered through crescent-shaped glasses as he scrutinized Fish not far away while shrugging somewhat helplessly. Though I know a lot of different languages, but that doesn't include cat language, you know, these little guys are always so fickle in their thinking, it's not easy to learn their language. Dumbledore walked over to Orr's side and tapped his wand twice on the wound, stopping the bleeding for now. Then, back to Hogwarts, let Madame Pomfrey treat you properly. Orr had been hired by Dumbledore to solve the owl problem, so he was responsible. As the greatest wizard in the modern world, Dumbledore had no choice but to go and deal with the situation, and he certainly didn't believe that the truth of the matter was a Death Eater plot, as Rita Skeeter had reported. But there had already been a lack of owls when Hogwarts had sent letters to students, and with Christmas approaching recently, it was time to use them in large numbers. With the Ministry of Magic asking for help, Dumbledore had to call on his old friend, or, the animagus, who could turn into an owl, for help. With Dumbledore's wisdom, he soon discovered a pattern of disappearing owls. Basically, they would all pass close to where the last one had disappeared to deliver its message, and then disappear after it. The assassins who attacked the owls seemed to have initiated the action only because they saw them. That's why Dumbledore hired Orr to take the form of an owl and fly over the area where the last victim had delivered his message. Dumbledore hadn't held out much hope, he had only tried without further clues, but he hadn't expected to hit the suspect with such success. But if the killer was a cat, it seemed to make sense, given the pattern he had been speculating on. That's what Dumbledore thought, and that's what he told Orr. So this little guy is no ordinary cat. Orr touched his neck, which had stopped bleeding, but still hurt. Ordinary cats don't have that strength, he probably has the blood of some magical creature. It should be Hafniazel, I think. I remember something about it in Scamander's book, Dumbledore replied casually. We'd better take it back and have Minerva confirm it. With that, Dumbledore raised his wand, pointing it at Fish, who was slowly retreating. Ha! Hearing the humans in front of him trying to grab him, Fish arched his back, his fur popping as he made a threatening sound towards them. But none of the mages took Fish's threat seriously. Don't worry, little one, we won't hurt you, Dumbledore said with a smile, and with a wave of his wand, he turned a stone from the sidelines into a cage and wrapped Fish in it. The next moment, however, the silver-grey tabby shrank to palm size, slipped through the gap in the cage, and scampered off toward the end of the alley. I'm afraid it's not of beaver blood, I don't recall beavers having such powers. At this point, Dumbledore had basically confirmed the culprit in the owl's disappearance. The cat was on the run. He waved his wand once more, creating an even thinner cage, and covered Fishy again. But this time, Fishy was prepared to avoid the cage, leaving Dumbledore's spell in vain once again. The cat was about to turn the corner and get out of sight, but Dumbledore still waved his wand casually, and a dead branch lying at the end of the alley turned into a bowl-sized python, which rose up in front of the cat. Fish had never eaten a snake before, so he shook out his fur and swelled to 1/2 meter in length, gave the snake's head a swipe, then turned his head and bit the back of the snake's head, shaking it several times. Normally, a normal snake would have been helpless against Fish's flurry of movements and taken to its belly, but this snake had been transformed by Dumbledore using a transfiguration spell, so it was not long before it became a rope and coiled around Fish, who was biting it. However, Fish, who was bound, surprised the two mages once again, as the tiger-spotted cat used his claws to free himself from his bonds. Bull's brute strength, increase your own strength. Freed from the ropes, Fish sensed that the two humans were not easy to deal with and scurried around the corner as fast as he could, getting out of sight, and ducking into the nearby bushes to hide. Eliminate scent, other creatures can't track the recipient with their sense of smell. Concealment, use the surrounding plants to reduce the chance of being spotted. Dumbledore rounded the corner and was surprised to see that he had lost sight of the tabby cat. Ha 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 ha. If the others knew that the famous Dumbledore had lost to a cat time and time again, it would shock the magical world, or, who had come with Dumbledore, laughed out loud. He had been a little uncomfortable with his own defeat at the hands of the cat, but now that even Dumbledore had been defeated as he had, or was balanced. If I give away my precious cockroach cone, can I get you to help me keep it a secret? Dumbledore took no offense at his old friend's teasing and joked cheerfully with Or. Or rolled his eyes in disbelief. Dumbledore's taste was as bad as ever, better keep it to yourself. If Scamander knew of this little one's existence, he would be very interested in him, and I think he would make a good Christmas present. Dumbledore raised his wand and tapped his glasses, a faint luminescence clung to them and Dumbledore spotted Fish hiding in the bushes. Fish noticed Dumbledore's gaze and, without hesitation, turned and ran. Probably wanting to see what else Fish could do, Dumbledore did not rush to catch him, but watched with a smile as Fish took off and then slowly found the hiding place. This hiding went on for several times, and Fish did his best to get away from the two strange humans. To be precise, he couldn't get away from the one in the blue robe. Fleeing once again from the two humans, Fish opted to hide in a garbage can, a place that, as he recalled, few humans would like to be near. Unfortunately, however, came the familiar sound of footsteps and, once again, he seemed to be found by the two humans. It's about time, Dumbledore, that little one is surely afraid of you, Or finally said as he saw that this time Fish was hiding in the trash can. Sorry, it was a spur-of-the-moment thing for me too. At Or's reminder, Dumbledore realized he had wasted too much time on that cat. He pursed his lips in confusion. Normally Dumbledore only found ways to test and exercise his students by various means when it came to those he valued. It was an expression of love Dumbledore felt for the younger generation. Of course, this was also a function of Fish's animal affinity, a spell that affects wizards even if they are resistant to it. Or was behaving normally, while Dumbledore's way of expressing intimacy was a bit unusual. Not wanting to torment Fish any further, Dumbledore waved his wand and the trash can Fish had been hiding in slowly lifted off the ground. After being 3 feet off the ground, he did a 180-degree turn and poured everything inside it. Puff! Puff! The first thing to fall to the ground were several black garbage bags tied together and some small pieces of garbage scattered through the holes in the bags. Then, a 7 or 8-year-old boy fell out of the dumpster. The boy had silver-gray hair and large, distinctive green eyes. His pupils were like a cat's, and the moment he saw Dumbledore and Orr, the vertical pupils changed from needle-like upright pupils to round pupils that almost took up the entire eyeball. The problem was, he was naked. As soon as he touched the ground, the boy rested his hands on the floor, his back arched high like a curved bow, and gave Dumbledore and Orr a fierce expression as he emitted an intimidating sound from his throat. "Ha! Dumbledore! Are you still going to give it to Scamander?" asked Orr, looking at Dumbledore beside him. Chapter 7, Animagus. Animal form, take the form of an animal you know. This was a spell Fish had suddenly learned in a moment of desperation, and so he opted to become human, and if he did, those two strange humans would leave him alone, wouldn't they? Unfortunately, the two humans in front of him didn't seem confused by Fish's spell. After a moment's stunned moment, the white-bearded human, once again raised the small wooden stick in his hand. A blue glow erupted from the tip of Dumbledore's wand, and struck Fish. Meow! The light was too fast for Fish to dodge and he was hit squarely, making him jump from his spot in fright. But he soon realized that the light didn't seem to do him any harm, and after a dazzling flash of light, nothing happened to him. Meow! Fish cocked his head, confused, and then arched his back once more at Dumbledore and Orr, growling, "Ha! Is it really human?" Dumbledore blinked in surprise with his blue eyes. He couldn't be sure what exactly the cat was, so he had just used a spell that undid the Transfiguration and Animagus spell. What Dumbledore didn't know was that Fish's Transfiguration spells were fundamentally different from the wizard's system, so his Dispel spell had no effect on Fish. "So, this boy is also an Animagus." Dumbledore, who had mistaken Fish for a human, looked at Orr, who was also an Animagus. "Why are you looking at me? I'm an Animagus too, but Animagi don't have senses or anything to distinguish them." Orr waved his hands. He was nothing more than an Animagus, an ordinary wizard. He wasn't much help. "If you don't know, I don't know." Seeing that the two humans seemed to ignore him, Fish took the opportunity to turn and run. It was very uncomfortable running on all fours in his human form, so after a couple of beats he opted to straighten up and move his legs as a two-legged beast normally would, but since he wasn't very familiar with this way of moving, he stumbled a bit at first, but soon got used to it and waved his short legs as fast as he could. However, before Fish could get very far, he felt his feet lift into the air and he floated like a balloon. Meow! Meow 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 meow! Fish flailed his arms and legs wildly, his body morphing between cat and two-legged beast. "Well, I suppose we'd better take it to Minerva and ask her." A red light erupted from the tip of Dumbledore's cane and landed on Fish, who was still dancing in the air. He didn't even have time to yawn before his eyelids closed as if with glue. "Or, hold my shoulders!" Waving his wand and sending the sleeping Fish flying into his arms, Dumbledore used the apparition spell that took him and Orr away. With a deafening pop sound, the three instantly appeared in front of the Hogwarts school hospital. Hogwarts had always forbidden wizards to use the apparition spell, but Dumbledore, as headmaster, had the privilege. "Comey!" Dumbledore called to a house elf, "Go fetch Professor McGonagall." "At your service, my dear headmaster." The house elf let out a shrill cry of excitement and bowed deeply to Dumbledore, his head almost touching the floor before disappearing with a snap. "It's all right, Orr, go and let Madame Pomfrey treat your neck for now, and when Minerva comes, let her talk to the boy." Dumbledore scooped Fish up in his arms and pushed open the door to the school hospital. Orr's injuries were not serious and had already been lightly treated by Dumbledore, so Madame Pomfrey merely handed Orr a vial of a somewhat strange-tasting healing potion and had him hold his nose and pour it in. "Who is this child?" After watching Orr take the medicine, Madame Pomfrey looked at the little boy that Dumbledore had placed on the bed. "At least, he will be a future student of our school?" "Ah, Minerva, there you are," Dumbledore said. "Dumbledore, what happened?" asked Professor McGonagall as she hurried into the infirmary. "I need you to identify this child for me." Dumbledore pointed to the still sleeping Fish and briefly explained his origins. "I suspect that the child may have been born an animagus, and that both of his parents must have died, which is why he has been in the company of wild cats." Actually, there was another suspicion that Dumbledore did not say, that the boy's parents were probably both muggles, and had abandoned their son for being a monster when they discovered he had been turned into a cat. Dumbledore had seen many similar things, the most famous of which was probably Tom Riddle. An animagus by birth? But aren't they just born shifters? A shifter is a wizard who has the innate ability to change their physical appearance according to their will. A wizard who is born as an animal? I've never heard of that. Professor McGonagall glared at Fish, who was curled up in his bed, sleeping soundly. And who can guarantee that we know all the mysteries of magic? There are many things that even I haven't seen, Minerva. And, more importantly now, helping this child get back to a normal human life, Dumbledore said. You're right, Professor McGonagall nodded. Whether the little boy was an animagus, or a cat for some other reason, they had to guide him back to a normal life. Professor McGonagall breathed a sigh of relief at the thought. Good thing Dumbledore had found him first, because if the dark wizards had found the poor boy first, he would have been in real danger. To prevent Fish from overreacting, Dumbledore and the others exited the medical room, leaving only Professor McGonagall. With a wave of her wand, Professor McGonagall cast a sobering spell on Fish and she transformed into a silver cat that looked very much like Fish. Only around the eyes of the silver tabby cat that McGonagall had transformed into, there were lines in the shape of the square glasses she wore. Waking from his sleep, Fish stretched out on the bed with his eyes closed before jumping out of bed with a start. As quickly as he could, Fish crawled under the bed, where the light was lower, and looked around with his big green eyes, not finding the two humans. Instead, there was a tiger-spotted adult cat that looked like him crouched in a chair not far away. Meow. You were captured by humans too. Seeing his own, Fish came out from under the bed and asked the tiger-spotted cat in the chair. Only after asking did Fish realize that his vision was not up to par and that he was still in human form. He quickly undid the spell and returned to his original form. Meow, meow. No, I'm an animagus, just like you. Professor McGonagall replied in cat language, and then did the opposite of Fish, changing from tabby cat to human. Chapter 8, Raising a Cat. Meow, 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 easy, kid, I'm the same kind of person as you, we call ourselves animagi. Professor McGonagall resumed the form of a tiger-spotted cat and explained to Fish. Meow, meow, meow. My name is McGonagall, Minerva McGonagall, what's yours? Professor McGonagall asked. Meow, meow. My name is Fish, and no, I'm not human. Fish was thrilled to see that McGonagall was human like him, but when she called herself a human and classified him as such, Fish wasn't so happy. He wasn't one of those humans without teeth and sharp claws and very little body hair. Meow. Poor child. Of course, Professor McGonagall didn't know that Fish was telling the truth. She thought he had lived with stray cats since he was a child and didn't remember who he was. After all, it was rare, but not uncommon, to find wolf children and monkey children all over the world. Sensing that Fish had grown impatient at his initial closeness, Professor McGonagall did not argue with Fish any further on the subject. Meow, meow. So Fish, are you hungry? Professor McGonagall asked. Meow. Meow 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 meow. I'm starving. I was going to catch an owl, and then it turned into a human, and came with another human with a white beard to catch me. Fish was furious when I talked about the guy who could turn into a human. Why did he have to chase him? Meow, wait here, I'll get you something to eat. Professor McGonagall rubbed her head at Fish, then returned to her human form and headed for the door. Meow, Fish cocked his head to the side and watched Professor McGonagall leave before taking a closer look around the room. Aside from stealing fish from Evan's store, Fish rarely entered human homes, and he circled the medical room twice before returning to the bed and plopping down on the white pillows. Fish wagged the tip of his tail in small circles, eyes squinting comfortably. No wonder many of his kind like to stay with humans when they have such good things to offer besides food. Just as Fish was enjoying the softness of the pillow, Professor McGonagall pushed open the door and entered carrying a silver tray with roast chicken, fried fish, and a bowl of pumpkin juice. Meow, Fish, who had been napping on his pillow, caught the smell and jumped to his feet, hopping up onto the table and running greedily back and forth in front of Professor McGonagall, who had come to the table, his head tilted up and his eyes fixed on the plate in Professor McGonagall's hands. Easy, little one. The ever-serious Professor McGonagall was all smiles at this point, and she reached out cheerfully to pat Fish's little head. Since he could also transform into a cat, he did not resist her touch as he had done in the past, but placed his two front paws on Professor McGonagall's robe and cried urgently, meow, 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 meow. Eat, 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 but it's easier to eat these things as a human. Professor McGonagall didn't want to tease Fish anymore and placed the plate on the table. Indeed, Fish could understand what Professor McGonagall was saying. Even a normal cat could understand some human language, let alone a feline druid who had been optimized by the World Tree Shard. But even if he did understand, Fish, who preferred his furry body, pretended not to hear and pounced on the roast chicken with gusto. Biting down hard on the roast chicken, Fish struggled a bit to tear off a piece of meat. Then he bobbed his little head, using his inertia and tongue to bring the chicken to the back of his teeth and chewed it a couple of times before swallowing. Meow! Fish's eyes narrowed as he swallowed the chicken, and a purr of satisfaction escaped his throat. Food cooked and processed by humans was more delicious than raw meat, but it was unfortunate that most humans fed on raw or relatively tasteless tasting food. If you think about it, it's not so bad to be mistaken for a human or an animagus, is it? Fish's ears twitched as the idea occurred to him, but he soon turned his attention back to the food in front of him. Never mind that, let's fill up first. After sticking out his tongue and licking the crumbs that had just fallen from his mouth onto the table, Fish proceeded to bite into the roast chicken. Seeing that Fish was still eating like a cat, Professor McGonagall did not rush, but waited until Fish had devoured most of the roast chicken and was licking her paws before she reached out and plucked a small strip of meat from the roast chicken and slowly popped it into her mouth, then took a small sip of the pumpkin juice. After this demonstration, Professor McGonagall smiled and repeated what she had just said to Fish in cat language. Fish cocked his head to one side and looked at Professor McGonagall for a moment before continuing to lick his paws and wash his face. "You're very good, but I don't listen to you." When he was a kitten, Fish was a free spirit. Professor McGonagall knew there was no hurry, so she just stroked Fish's back and watched with a smile as the boy rubbed his paws all over his face. Then, when Fish lowered his head to lick one of his more specific areas, Professor McGonagall reached up and blocked his head with her palm. "Meow!" meowed Fish. Professor McGonagall flinched at the puzzled look she received from Fish. It was really important to help the boy return to his normal human habits as soon as possible. "Are you sure you want to adopt this child, Minerva?" asked Dumbledore, wiping his half-moon spectacles, resting them on the bridge of his nose, and looking seriously at Professor McGonagall. "I can contact other wizarding families, and I'm sure they would be delighted to adopt Fish," Dumbledore said. "But they can't communicate with Fish as well as I can they? Besides, Albus, don't you think the boy and I have a connection?" Professor McGonagall was referring to Fish in his cat form, with the same silver tiger spots as her. "If you insist, then there's no reason for me to stop," Dumbledore sighed, unconcerned that Professor McGonagall would neglect her work at Hogwarts because of Fish, and offered, "Well, shall I find another house in Hogsmeade?" In fact, Professor McGonagall herself owned a small house in Hogsmeade, which her husband had purchased to facilitate her work at Hogwarts. Unfortunately, shortly after her marriage, her husband, Elphinstone, died unexpectedly from the bite of a poisonous tentacle. Unable to bear the thought of being alone in her cottage, Professor McGonagall packed up and returned to Hogwarts after Elphinstone's funeral, and the cottage was never used again. Dumbledore knew Professor McGonagall's past and what she was going through, which is why he had not considered leaving Fish in Professor McGonagall's care. "You know, Albus, I have property in Hogsmeade," Professor McGonagall smiled, politely declining Dumbledore's kind offer. "I see. So, Comey," with another sigh, Dumbledore did not try to persuade, but called the house elf from earlier. "Perhaps you need a house elf, to look after that child, Fish, while you're away." This time Professor McGonagall did not refuse Dumbledore's offer, since, as vice-headmistress of Hogwarts and head of Gryffindor, she still had a heavy workload at Hogwarts and needed someone to watch Fish in her place. As a feline animagus, and having been around cats since she was a child, Minerva McGonagall knew exactly how much trouble these furry little creatures could cause. Chapter 9, Daily Life in the McGonagall House. At 5 o'clock in the morning, while it was still light outside, Professor Minerva McGonagall woke up according to her own habits, rolled over and sat up from the bed, grabbed her wand, which was on the headboard, and with a wave of the wand, the emerald green robe and black peaked cap hanging from the hanger flew over her body automatically. Putting away her wand and putting on her square glasses, Professor McGonagall washed herself at the sink before opening the door to her locked room. It couldn't be helped. Before Fish's routine was adjusted, the little boy always ran around at night and Professor McGonagall had to make sure she got enough sleep for her work the next day. Professor McGonagall went down the wooden staircase on the first floor, which creaked as she walked because it was a bit old. By this time, the Hogwarts house elves had prepared a hearty breakfast and placed it neatly on the first floor dining room table. "Good morning, Professor McGonagall," Comey greeted Professor McGonagall in a high-pitched voice as she placed the messy items back in their original place. "Hello, Comey," Professor McGonagall nodded to the house elf, then looked at the furniture lying around her and sighed helplessly. No doubt little Fish had been naughty again last night. She and Fish had moved into their old house some time ago, but not much progress had been made in Fish's education. The boy still liked to run around in his cat form, and even his routine was still mainly waking up at night. Of course, this was also related to Professor McGonagall being so busy with her work that she didn't have much time to teach him. "I'll have to wait until after the vacations to teach him properly," Professor McGonagall sighed helplessly again, thinking to herself. The end of the term was still half a year away, and even though there was Christmas and Easter vacations in between, as Dean of Gryffindor, Professor McGonagall had to stay at school and manage the students who decided to stay, and even if she had time to visit Hogsmeade from time to time, she wouldn't be staying long. "It's time for me to go to school, don't let Fish run." Professor McGonagall wiped her mouth with her handkerchief as she finished her breakfast and said to Comey. Although it would be unfair to keep Fish locked up in the house, the way he was acting, Professor McGonagall wouldn't dare let him out. That would be a disaster. Not to mention that Hogsmeade is home to a post office with over 200 owls, and although Fish has now developed a habit of eating cooked food, who knows if he'll ever go out owling again on a whim. "Don't worry, Professor McGonagall, Master Fish is a good boy most of the time." Comey, the house elf, defended in defense of Fish, who, aside from his animal affinity, was basically telling the truth. During the day, Fish spent most of his time sleeping, waking occasionally to eat and entertain himself with something to get his energy out, and had no intention of going outside. Most cats are homebodies by nature, even strays like Fish, who have been given a place to live, have lost their desire to roam. Fish, who used to run around, was purely because no one could catch him, and until he learned the benefits of having a home, it was natural for a wary kitty to resist and run away when someone tried to catch him. Meow. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, Fish, who was lying on the pillow in a strange sleeping position, opened his eyes groggily. As soon as he twisted his body and got up from the pillow, Fish stretched his hips and stretched his waist. After stomping on the pillow several times with his 4 little paws, he simply squatted down and began the routine steps of licking his paw and washing his face. After doing all of this, Fish jumped off the bed and rushed out of the room, quickly landing on the stair railing in a couple of hops, and then running into the dining room without stopping. As soon as he entered the dining room, Fish jumped onto a chair at the table, as his body rapidly expanded and took on a human form. Meow. Comey. The humanoid fish landed lightly on the chair, tapped the empty table with one hand and shouted the name of the house elf. And Comey quickly brought the stored breakfast to the table. Meow, Fish cheered, reached out to grab one of the fried fish on the table and popped it into his mouth with gusto. If Professor McGonagall has made any progress during this time, it is that Fish has finally gotten used to eating in human form. It is true that human teeth are better at chewing food than cat teeth, and Fish, who is very persistent when it comes to eating, quickly accepted this way of eating, although he now only adopts the human form when he eats. Also, Fish is still naked. Professor McGonagall had given him a suit, but Fish had taken it off because it was uncomfortable. After all, he had always been naked and didn't like wearing anything on him. Comey stared at Fish naked for a few moments, then went quietly to the corner and began banging her head against the wall. After gobbling down his breakfast, Fish began licking his greasy hands, and after a few licks that didn't look too comfortable, he opened his squinted eyes to look at the white paws in front of him. Meow, with a grimace of disgust, Fish returned to his feline form and continued licking his paws. After licking his paws, Fish jumped out of the chair satisfied with his long tail and began his daily patrol of the territory. That is, he paced up and down the house. During his rounds, Fish found some good-looking stool legs or wooden cabinets to sharpen his claws on, adding some new claw marks to them. Next, he crept back up to Comey, but even as he was slapped, Comey stood there dumbfounded and uninterested, and after a few moments of excitement, Fish gave up and went back to pushing bottles and jars off the table onto the floor. Fish's excitement grew as he saw Comey trying to clean up the mess. "Master Fish! Stop! Don't drop it! Professor McGonagall will be mad when she comes back." Hearing Comey's shouts, Fish, who had had enough, wagged his tail and let the poor house elf go. After wandering around the house, Fish went to the balcony, found an empty flower pot and dove into it to take a nap. Even though it was winter now, he was occasionally able to get a little sun on the balcony, and the cold wind outside is nothing to Fish. And the planter is the perfect size for Fish and is one of his favorite places to sleep, as well as his pillow. Usually cats sleep for long, fragmented periods of time, but most of their sleep is really light and they wake up easily. In Fish's case, however, he doesn't need as much sleep as the rest of his kind, so it's now more of a habit and a pastime for him. After staying in the pot for a while, Fish jumped out of it and went back to wandering around the villa. Looking here, scratching there, occasionally nibbling on the leg of a stool or something to sharpen his teeth, swooping down to slap Comey when he wasn't looking, and then quickly slinking away again. After venting his energy in the aforementioned manner, Fish went back to sleep in the planter. This repeats over and over again, except for a couple of meows when he is hungry, and why Comey presented him with food, is basically how Fish spends his days. A cat's life is so simple and boring. But Fish enjoyed it. Click, at midnight, the door to the house opened from outside. Fish, who had been napping by the kitchen, instantly straightened up and ran to Professor McGonagall, who had just returned from Hogwarts. Meow. Fish leapt into Professor McGonagall's arms, his front paws on his neck, and stood up, licking her face with his tongue. There, little one, Professor McGonagall let out a giggle of delight as she avoided Fish's scratchy little tongue after a long day. She lifted Fish by the armpits and placed a kiss on the kitten's head. Come on, let's go to dinner. Feeling healed, Professor McGonagall smiled as she led Fish into the dining room. And on cue, Comey prepared dinner. The next minute, Professor McGonagall's good mood was gone. Fish. Why are you taking your clothes off again? Get dressed. Meow. Omega. Fish meowed in confusion. Don't pretend you don't understand what I'm saying, scolded Professor McGonagall. Meow, Omega. Meowed Fish again, still looking confused. No dinner if you don't get dressed, said Professor McGonagall with a stern face. Meow. Equals fi equals. Fish meowed, running away. Come back here. Where do you think you're going with that food in your mouth? Said Professor McGonagall. And then there was a chase through the house, a chorus of cat meows, Professor McGonagall's grunts, and the faint thump of a house elf's head against the wall. It was a lively day at McGonagall House, as always. Chapter 10, Live to Eat Meow. Time flew by, like the golden snitch. Fish spent the cold winter months in the cabin in Hogsmeade. The warmer the weather, the happier the cat was and the more relaxed his life was. Little did Fish know, however, that his life of leisure would soon come to an end. Since Hogwarts will soon be on summer vacation, Professor McGonagall will have plenty of time to correct Fish's bad habits. Not to mention that Professor McGonagall was very angry after Slytherin won this year's cup. Fish. It's time for you to get up, said Fish, who was showing all sorts of strange sleeping positions on the pillow as usual, was suddenly picked up by someone. Meow. The poor kitten looked with wide, confused eyes at Professor McGonagall, who had woken him up. It was barely dawn, which was the equivalent of 6 or 7 in the morning by human time. Fish's little brain was so smart, and cats have a unique way of perceiving time, so he could tell what time it was without looking at the clock. Meow. After a long, drawn-out moan, Fish squirmed in Professor McGonagall's arms a few times and adjusted to a more comfortable position, stretching his limbs in the crook of Professor McGonagall's arm. Then, Fish curled into a ball in Professor McGonagall's arms and buried his head in his own body. Whatever you do, I'm going to sleep anyway. Professor McGonagall's cheeks twitched imperceptibly at Fish's adorable reaction, but she managed to keep her serious expression intact and carried the kitten in her arms to the sink. Today I will start by teaching you how to wash your face and brush your teeth the human way, Professor McGonagall said seriously as she held Fish in front of her with a stern face. Opening his mouth with a huge yawn, Fish twisted his head, licked the back of Professor McGonagall's hand and then opened his big round eyes, and meowed, meow. Meowing won't help. Once again, Professor McGonagall, who had almost been convinced by Fish's expression, took 2 deep breaths in succession and bellowed sternly, now. Immediately. Change. Fish stretched his head and licked the fur off his shoulders. Professor McGonagall grimaced at the sight of the kitten in her hands, which was again disregarding her words, and placed it in the sink before slipping her hand into her coat pocket. Once he regained his freedom, Fish didn't run away, but sat on the sink. He still likes it here, it's cold and a good place to nap when it's warm. But before Fish could close his eyes, he was attracted by a sweet scent. Meow, seeing the bee candy in Professor McGonagall's hand, Fish got up and put his 2 little paws on Professor McGonagall's robe, letting out a meow. So, what should you do now, Professor McGonagall waved the bee candy in her hand and watched Fish's head bob from side to side as she waved her hand, a winning smile on her face. Meow. Without a word, Fish transformed into a human and waved his short hands to grab the candy from Professor McGonagall's hand. You've taken your clothes off again. Professor McGonagall's eyebrows rose at the sight of Fish naked in the sink. Meow. Fish didn't care, and reached out his hands to grab the bee candy. With a flick of her fingers, Professor McGonagall, who already knew the little guy's temperament, tossed the bee candy into the air and suspended it below the ceiling. It hovered below the ceiling. If you want candy, get dressed and wash up after me, and I'll give you the candy, said Professor McGonagall. Meow. Fish reluctantly glanced at the bee candy floating in the air and jumped out of the sink. Although it wasn't difficult for him to grab the candy in the air with his skill, Minerva wasn't going to simply watch as he ran to grab the bee candy. After countless confrontations over the past 6 months, Fish had learned the difference between him and the Minerva, so he wasn't going to waste his energy trying. If he wanted to eat the candy, he would have to do as he was told. Put your robes on. Professor McGonagall used a flying spell to conjure a small wizard robe and tossed it to Fish, whose eyes were still fixed on the candy. Meow, Fish replied weakly as he haphazardly pulled the robe on. You're wearing it backwards. Professor McGonagall, who had always been strict, went to help Fish put the robe back on. The robe was so clean you could tell it was the first time it had been worn, but it made Fish very uncomfortable. He pulled the collar tightly and twisted it uneasily for a while. Finally, he simply squatted down directly on the ground and lifted his right foot up to his chin. Then he rolled onto the floor. Meow. Meowed Fish. The human body is so uncomfortable. Fish immediately returned to his cat form and quickly shook his hind legs to scratch his chin and neck area. Comfortable. Professor McGonagall understood that there was no way to teach Fish in one step, so she silently watched Fish scratch his itch. And as Fish scratched, he raised his hind legs and then moved his head to his lower body. Fish, now Professor McGonagall had to stop him. Meow, Fish raised his head and looked at Professor McGonagall with big, confused eyes. Professor McGonagall said nothing, but pointed to the bee candy. Meow. Only then did Fish remember the existence of the candy, and reluctantly returned to his human form. Looking at the new wizard robe loosely draped over Fish's body, Professor McGonagall closed her eyes and took a few deep breaths, forcing herself not to pay attention, before grabbing a set of toiletries from a shelf and showing Fish how to use them. First of all, brush your teeth. Professor McGonagall handed Fish a toothbrush with paste on it and, holding one in her own hand, stuck it in her mouth to show her how to do it. Meow. Intrigued by the sudden bubbles in Minerva's mouth, Fish followed Minerva's example and stuck the toothbrush in his mouth. Sweet, it was cream. Fish's eyes lit up and then, without hesitation, he swallowed the creamy white coating on the toothbrush that looked suspiciously like some kind of cream. Fish. That's not for eating. Professor McGonagall scolded him with a mouthful of foam when she saw that, instead of brushing his teeth, Fish had started licking the toothpaste off the bristles. Meow. Don't eat it even if it's good. Those things are not for eating. Meow. If you follow me and learn to wash your face and brush your teeth, I'll give you something good to eat, or you'll just have crisps for breakfast. Professor McGonagall used her best jab at Fish. Meow. It's no use pretending to be pitiful. After half a year together, Professor McGonagall had become much more resistant to Fish and was no longer easily fooled by her flirtatiousness. Chapter 11, Being cute is a necessary survival skill for cats. Meow. Fish pouted helplessly as he watched Minerva refuse to budge. The animal's affinity was getting worse and worse, and now even Comey wasn't as obedient as he used to be, jumping up from time to time to say no to this and no to that. But Fish never worried about the house elf, who was too scared to do anything but bang his head against the wall. But the big cat, Minerva, was different, for he couldn't beat her, and now it was no use for him to act cute like he used to. Yes, Fish wanted to eat treats, he could only be obedient. Angrily, he put the toothbrush back in his mouth and fiddled with it like Minerva. But as the bubbles in his mouth grew, Fish suddenly found the game interesting. Puff. Puff. Watching Fish happily spit a bunch of bubbles out of his mouth, Professor McGonagall thought for a moment, but didn't interfere. It's not easy for this little guy to brush his teeth obediently, and this little problem can be slowly corrected in the future. When Fish had had enough, Professor McGonagall began to teach him how to rinse his mouth again. Fish gargled and then swallowed the fresh water from the toothpaste in his mouth. Didn't I say spit it out? Professor McGonagall immediately reprimanded. Meow, Fish meowed, pitifully. I told you it was useless to act pathetic, Professor McGonagall said. So Fish grabbed a glass of water from the sink, took a mouthful, quickly spat it out, and looked at Professor McGonagall with his big green eyes. Meow. Professor McGonagall was both amused and annoyed to see that little creature acting like a pious child again, but she kept a cold face and stared into Fish's eyes. Fish turned his head away from Professor McGonagall's gaze, his large, quirky eyes blinking rapidly, glancing at his from time to time. Then, Fish's eyes slowly returned to the bee's candy on the ceiling. Next up is the face wash. Professor McGonagall grabbed a counting towel from the coat rack, and blocked Fish's view. Meow. Taking the towel from Minerva, Fish cocked his head to the side and looked confused at the black and white striped towel in his hand. Of course he knew what the word wash meant, it was an activity he did every day, but why did she have to use this strange cloth to wash his face? Fish blinked and suddenly realized when he saw his hairless hands. Humans' paws don't have hair, so they have to use these fluffy cloths instead. Feeling he had discovered the truth, Fish neatly wrapped the towel around his left hand and stuck out his tongue to lick it. No, that's not how you use a towel, Professor McGonagall held Fish's head, preventing him from continuing. Watch this. Removing her glasses from the bridge of her nose, Professor McGonagall grabbed another towel and showed Fish how to wash her face. Fish was very happy to wash his face, and was still waiting to eat the candy, so he didn't make any more noise, and did the same as Professor McGonagall. Very good, Professor McGonagall nodded in satisfaction, before letting the bee candy fall into Fish's hand. Meow, Fish squinted happily, popping the candy into his mouth as quickly as he could. Come on, it's time we went to breakfast. Professor McGonagall took Fish's hand and led him into the dining room. Fish was always very active at mealtime and, after eating the candy, naturally followed Minerva to the table obediently. Today's breakfast was as generous as ever, and as always, Comey, the house elf, had prepared a generous portion of meat for Fish. Meow, Fish, who couldn't resist the meat, reached out to grab the sausage in front of him, but was stopped by Minerva. Meow, Fish meowed in confusion. Starting today, you will learn to eat with cutlery, Professor McGonagall said seriously as she slipped a silver knife and fork into Fish's hands. Meow, Fish looked at the two strange tools in his hands. He knew the function of the knife and fork, he had seen them used more than once by humans to divide food. After staring at the knife and fork in his hands for a moment, Fish stuck out his tongue and licked it, as was his habit. It was cold and tasteless. Then, clang clang. Tossing the knife and fork aside, Fish again extended his little hand toward the sausage. He doesn't want to use such a troublesome thing. It's more convenient to just use his claws. Professor McGonagall sighed, anticipating Fish's reaction, and waved her wand. Meow, Fish was about to catch the sausage when it slipped out of his fingers and floated into the air, just like the bee candy from earlier. And not only the sausage, but all the other food flew away, floating above the table. You could see it, but you couldn't eat it. Meow, Fish's big green eyes instantly looked at Professor McGonagall. Professor McGonagall said nothing, but pointed to the knife and fork Fish had tossed aside. Meow, Fish lowered his head slightly, kept his mouth shut, and raised his eyes to look at Professor McGonagall with pity. Fish's pupils were now dilated to the maximum, almost filling the green of his eyes, leaving only a small green ring at the edge. If he were in his cat form, his ears would flop to the sides. The dilated pupils and droopy ears were the best solution Fish could come up with after countless attempts at feigning pity, which, combined with animal affinity, worked wonders with humans. However, as stated earlier, Professor McGonagall had become very resistant to Fish's cute ways over the past 6 months. So, although Professor McGonagall's heart fluttered, she kept her expression serious and fingered the knife and fork on the table. Meow, Fish grimaced helplessly at the futility of pretending to be pitiful and retrieved the knife and fork he had tossed aside. Smiling, Professor McGonagall reached out and rubbed Fish's head, but Fish angrily pushed her hand away. Meow. A furious Fish glared at Professor McGonagall, then waved the knife and fork at the food still floating in the air. She had grabbed the knife and fork, why didn't she just put the food down? But Fish's tender look made Professor McGonagall reach over and squeeze her little cheek. Meow, Fish snapped his head unceremoniously and bit Professor McGonagall's palm. Of course, he did so without force, as angry as he was. Minerva, the only human Fish currently recognized, had no intention of biting him. fish. Let go. Professor McGonagall was no match for Fish's reflexes and speed, and was surprised to be bitten, but Fish only gave his a small bite and let go of his mouth as soon as she made a noise. Don't you ever bite anyone again, do you hear me? Professor McGonagall lectured Fish with a nasty pat on the head, before letting the food fall back onto the table. Too busy eating to pay attention to Professor McGonagall's intentions, Fish stuck his fork into the sausage as it flew towards him. Fish, who had never used a fork before, caught the relatively slippery sausage and, naturally, it slid off his fork. Meow. Fish, who had failed to get the sausage to stick to his fork, tried, but was soon followed by a warning cough from Professor McGonagall. Meow. An unhappy Fish grumbled at Professor McGonagall, then tossed aside the knife in his right hand and, with both hands clasped together, plunged the fork into the sausage. Crack! This time, Fish managed to stab the sausage, but the plate it was served on also broke in half. Fish gleefully nibbled the sausage on his fork, not caring about the cracked plate. He usually breaks them anyway. Chapter 12, Cat Training. With a wave of Professor McGonagall's wand, the cracked plate immediately returned to its original state, and Fish merely looked at it before continuing to bury himself in the food. The scene had shocked him at first, but after seeing it many times, it was no longer as important as filling his stomach. After nibbling the sausage on his fork in a rudimentary fashion, Fish did the same thing again, sticking his fork into a cutlet in a way that would have broken the plate. Professor McGonagall didn't try to correct him further. The fact that Fish was using the cutlery correctly was a great improvement, and she was going to teach him the tricks bit by bit, at least for the rest of the summer. After breaking the plate 5 times and sweeping the meat off the table, Fish licked the fork up and down until there was no grease on it, then tossed it aside and fell over the side, tumbling off the chair. By the time Fish landed, he had regained his cat form. Yawning with his mouth open, Fish wagged his tail, intending to find a comfortable place to lie down for a while. Just as Fish turned around, however, he was lifted up by the back of his neck by Professor McGonagall. Meow. Fish turned his head and looked at Minerva in confusion. Lifting Fish back to the empty table, Professor McGonagall said, "Next, we're going to learn some words." Meow. Undeterred, Fish lay down on his side of the table, head resting on his front paws, and began to doze off. You learn, I sleep, no conflict. So Professor McGonagall resorted once again to snacks. Although Fish was already full, snacks were something neither cats nor children could resist. This time Professor McGonagall pulled out the licorice wand that was always available on the Hogwarts Express. Meow. Fish, who had just closed his eyes, stood up again, chasing the licorice wand in Professor McGonagall's hand and bouncing across the table. Professor McGonagall waved her wand, and a series of golden points of light erupted from its tip, forming a large letter A in front of Fish. Meow. Intrigued by the golden letter, Fish jumped up from the table and pounced on the A. The kitten turned the golden A into a ball of light, but quickly recomposed itself and formed the letter again. After swiping a few more times in a row, Fish found it impossible to grasp the glowing letter and soon lost interest, turning his attention back to the licorice wand in Minerva's hand. The sweet scent of plants and plant fragrances were very appealing to Fish, who is a druid. Meow. Fish wiggled his little pink nose and went to tug on Professor McGonagall's hand again. Professor McGonagall raised her licorice wand above her hand to keep it out of Fish's reach and made her request, "Will you learn words?" Meow. Meowed Fish as he nodded. "Then turn back into a human," said Professor McGonagall. Meow. Fish had no choice but to return to his toddler form, lying on the dining room table. "Sit here." Professor McGonagall patted the chair next to her and, after a moment's delay, Fish squirmed and slid from the table to the chair next to Professor McGonagall. "Come on, say it with me, A." After lifting Fish off the table and sitting him down, Professor McGonagall pointed to the golden letters floating on the table and began teaching Fish how to pronounce them. "Meow," said Fish. "It's A. Look at my mouth." Professor McGonagall pointed to her mouth and patiently taught her. "Ow," said Fish. "A," repeated Professor McGonagall. "Woo," said Fish. A, said Professor McGonagall. Said Fish. Yes, it's close enough." Once again, A, said Professor McGonagall as she nodded. Said Fish. "That's it. Only a few more to go, and you're absolutely right," said Professor McGonagall. Said Fish. "One last time, don't bring up the end, come on, Fish," said Professor McGonagall. Fish finally said. Excellent. Professor McGonagall put her arms around Fish, gave her a kiss on the cheek, and then brought the much-desired licorice wand to her mouth, which Fish naturally bit into without hesitation. When Fish had bitten into the licorice wand, Professor McGonagall pulled out a new one and waved it in front of him. Next is the second word, B. The golden letter changed to AB at the same time. Professor McGonagall was experienced in teaching, and had demonstrated her talent for training cats from an early age. The combination of this, and treats, meant that even though Fish was a special kitten, he was able to learn all 10 letters of the alphabet with a reasonable amount of cooperation. Not that Professor McGonagall didn't want to continue, but Fish had had enough snacks and was temporarily free of temptation. All right, go play, said Professor McGonagall as she patted Fish's head. The impatient Fish jumped up, somersaulted over the back of the chair and landed in his cat form, then ran away from Professor McGonagall on his fast 4 legs. Fish had no interest in learning, and would have run away if it weren't for the snacks that kept him on his feet. Unfortunately, today was only the beginning of Fish's schooling, as Professor McGonagall had a full education program for Fish well before the vacations. Fish, today we are going to learn a new word, said Professor McGonagall. Meow. Meowed Fish warily. I have the last of the Honeydukes candy here, said Professor McGonagall. Meow. Meowed Fish. After the last few days of exercise, Fish was no longer so easily tempted by food. Here's another Fluffy. Professor McGonagall pulled out a cream-colored fur ball and tossed it to Fish. The ball landed in front of Fishy, rolled twice and then licked Fishy with a long, thin tongue. Meow, Fish, in his human form, grabbed the fluffy ball in front of him and squeezed it twice, then, popped it in his mouth. Key. Pfft. The strange furball secreted a strange bodily fluid into his skin when irritated, and it tasted horrible. Fish had encountered similar things before, such as a large rat with the same black and white stripes, whose farts were extremely disgusting. Although he worried that the furball would also fart, what kitty could resist such a furry ball? Especially after playing with Fluffy and realizing that nothing happens if he doesn't get it in his mouth, Fish immediately fell in love with the strange furball creature and, naturally, couldn't escape today's lesson. Fish, today I'm going to teach you how to put on your underwear, said Professor McGonagall. After Fish got used to wearing the robe, Professor McGonagall began adding other garments to her body. I don't want meow, said Fish, running. Don't run. These clothes will be comfortable when you get used to them, said Professor McGonagall as she chased after him. I don't want to. Minerva is a big liar, said Fish, as he continued to run away. In the recent past, Fish had been tricked by Minerva into learning so many things, one at a time, that he was now wise enough not to fall for it again. Transformed into a cat, Fish ran up to the roof of the house and cowered behind the rafters. He had discovered that as long as he was out of Minerva's sight, many of her spells could not be cast on him. If you learn to wear human clothes properly, I'll take you to Honeydukes today, said Professor McGonagall. Fish was silent for a moment, cautiously poking his little head over the beam. Meow. Are you serious? Fish asked. When have I ever not kept my word? Professor McGonagall's face, once again, glowed with victory. Chapter 13, What Bad Intentions Can a Kitten Have? Although Fish had never actually seen what Honeydukes looked like, he knew from Minerva's previous deceptions that all the delicious snacks were brought from a place called Honeydukes. Fish, who had spent a lot of time wandering the human world, knew the concept of a store. It was a place where you could trade bits of paper and metal for all sorts of things. So when Minerva offered to take him to the legendary Honeydukes, Fish couldn't resist. He quickly jumped off the beam, transformed into his human form in midair and landed firmly in front of Professor McGonagall. Oh, by Merlin's beard, Professor McGonagall was taken aback by Fish's action, and rushed to catch him and check his situation from top to bottom. After discovering that Fish was uninjured, Professor McGonagall sighed in relief, then released Fish and scolded him sternly, "Don't make such a dangerous move in the future." Meow, Fish cocked his head in confusion, jumping from that height was not dangerous at all. But this wasn't important to Fish, it was important to get to Honeydukes. Where are the changing clothes? Fish took off the robe he was wearing, he was naked and gave Professor McGonagall's robe a tug. Didn't I tell you no nudity? Professor McGonagall slapped Fish's little head before calling Comey to bring the clothes she had prepared. Under Professor McGonagall's careful guidance, Fish was dressed in a full set of clothes and finally put on the previous robe. Why do you have to wear so many strange things, meow, Fish grumbled as he finished dressing. Even though Professor McGonagall had prepared a relatively loose-fitting set of clothes for his, he still felt very uncomfortable. The shoes and socks on his feet, in particular, felt uncomfortable. Could it be what humans who wore those things called shoes to make the sound of their footsteps obvious? Come on, Fish, it's time to go to Honeydukes. Professor McGonagall's call interrupted Fish's attempts to minimize the sound of his footsteps, and Fish immediately ignored the sound of his footsteps and scurried to Professor McGonagall's side, then tilted his little face to look at Professor McGonagall with great anticipation. Smiling, the teacher fried Fish's head with one hand, then took one of Fish's hands and walked out. It was the first time Fish had walked through Hogsmeade, and ever since he walked out the door, Fish had turned his little head tirelessly, curious about everything around him. It was the first time Fish had entered society in human form, and it was a completely different experience from his usual feline perspective. Although the wizard society before him was not the same as the human society Fish had known, to a cat there was little difference between the two, and it was all new to Fish anyway. It was summer vacation at Hogwarts at the moment, and there were no students in Hogsmeade, but there were still residents of the town, and a large number of wizards coming to spend their time there, including some professors who had come from Hogwarts to relax. It wasn't widely publicized that Professor McGonagall had adopted an animagus from birth, but most of the teachers and residents of the village had heard about it to some extent. So when they saw Professor McGonagall walking with a child they had never seen before, they all smiled politely at Fish. "Good morning, Minerva, is that the boy? What a charming little fellow, Professor McGonagall, is he the animagus from birth? Haha, no wonder you adopted him, Minerva, the little guy is as cute as a kitten." The words kept coming from various wizards. Professor McGonagall was responding kindly to all of them, but Fish didn't respond at all to the friendly words, he just found them loud. Professor McGonagall had no intention of teaching Fish manners so quickly. As she greeted her acquaintances, she led the way to the door of Honeydukes. However, Fish was not focused on the candy store he had been thinking about. His large green eyes were now almost completely filled with black pupils and he stared across the street at a house without blinking. It was the Hogsmeade village post office and housed at least 200 owls. The owls were placed on color-coded shelves for the wizards of Hogsmeade to choose from, and Fish could see the owls, large and small, through the windows of the post office. "Fish," Minerva's long, drawn-out call reached his ears, and Fish, unconsciously licking his lips, reluctantly looked away. "Remember what I told you before," said Professor McGonagall as she looked at Fish. "Owls are friends, not food," Fish replied reluctantly, pouting. Professor McGonagall didn't care how reluctant Fish was, she just knew that if she hadn't kept an eye on him, the owls in the post office would have fallen prey to this boy. To keep the little man from thinking about the post office owls any longer, Professor McGonagall dragged him by the arm into Honeydukes. "Welcome, Minerva." Mrs. Flume, the owner of Honeydukes, who looked to be the same age as Professor McGonagall, greeted her. Professor McGonagall had been a regular visitor to Honeydukes for some time and, with their similar age, Mrs. Flume was surprised to find that she and Professor McGonagall, who was said to be so serious and old-fashioned, got along quite well. "This young gentleman is Fish, isn't he? A little treat for your first meeting." Mrs. Flume took a bag of pear-flavored hard candy from a nearby shelf and placed it in Fish's hand. Fish was so dazzled by the variety of candy in the store that he didn't notice until Mrs. Flume put the pear candy in his hand. "Meow. Minerva. This is all for me," said Fish excitedly. "How can it be?" Professor McGonagall laughed and said, "You can choose 3 treats to take home today, and when you're good, I'll bring you some new ones." "Well, the pear hard candy in your hand doesn't count." Fish looked at the single bag of hard pear candy in his hand, and then at the dazzling array of candy around him. With one swift movement freed from Professor McGonagall's grasp, Fish spread his arms wide and grabbed a large handful of candy from a nearby shelf, ducked his head and ran for the door. Chapter 14, Wait Until You Grow Up. Fish's theft plan, of course, was unsuccessful. Professor McGonagall quickly caught Fish, who was about to run off with the sweets, led him to the corner of the wall, and began to scold him loudly. At Professor McGonagall's incessant lecturing, Fish pinched the hem of his robe and ducked his head, occasionally raising his emerald green eyes to look at Professor McGonagall and then quickly lowering them again. He looked miserable. By Fish's calculations, if he put up a facade like that, Minerva would probably let herself go after another 3 or 4 minutes of chanting. "Come on, Minerva," Fish is just a little boy, poor thing, he already knows he's wrong, but even before that, Mrs. Flume, who had little resistance to animal affinity, had fallen for Fish's charade and had taken the initiative to put in a good word for him, asking Professor McGonagall to let him go. Professor McGonagall, who knew Fish's character well, hesitated to speak and, after a few moments of stammering, gave up trying to explain. But even though Professor McGonagall waved Fish for Mrs. Flume's sake, the punishment was still deserved. Because of your naughtiness, there are only 2 snacks to choose from, Professor McGonagall told Fish with a serious expression. Meow, Fish was incredulous, then shouted, Minerva, you liar! You said you'd let me choose 3 candies, meow. Who told you to try to steal the candy here? That's your punishment for disobeying me. Professor McGonagall never gave an inch when it came to matters of principle. You didn't say I wasn't allowed to take the candy. Minerva is a liar. Big liar, however, Fish had his own reasons. As long as he hadn't been told beforehand, there was nothing wrong with what he had done. Fish thought he was doing the right thing, but unfortunately, his reasoning didn't work with Professor McGonagall, and no matter how much he argued, he couldn't get his to back down. In the end, Professor McGonagall had to drag Fish out of the Honeydukes with Mrs. Frum's hard pear candy and his own choice of candy, squeaky sugar mice and Bertie Bott's green gauges of all flavors. Meow, big liar, Minerva is a big liar, muttered Fish, opening the hard pear candy wrapper and sticking his whole face into the unwrapped bag, sticking his tongue out to pop a piece of candy into his mouth. As he rolled the candy around in his mouth with his tongue, making a delicious clattering sound against his teeth, Fish kept muttering in a slurred voice, liar, 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 liar. Professor McGonagall, knowing that the more attention she gave the boy, the more excited he became, pretended not to hear him, took Fish by the hand and they walked down the main street of Hogsmeade. Where are we going? Indeed, Fish stopped chattering when he realized that Minerva wasn't playing with him at all, and asked instead. The 3 Broomsticks, I have an appointment there, Professor McGonagall said. What's a bar? It's a place that sells drinks, a lot of wizards like to have a drink at the 3 Broomsticks, chat there and stuff. What's the 3 Broomsticks? Asked Fish. It's a place that sells drinks. A lot of wizards like to have a drink at the 3 Broomsticks and chat there, said Professor McGonagall. At first, Fish hated learning human language, but once he mastered the basics of communication, his curiosity overcame his aversion to learning, and this was reflected in his usual abundance of questions. Professor McGonagall was always patient with Fish's questions, answering them whenever she could. Why can't you drink, meow? Asked Fish. Because you're young, Professor McGonagall replied. But I want to drink, meow, Fish said with a pout on his face. You can't drink it even if you want to, said Professor McGonagall sternly. Fish. Even if Fish didn't say anything, Professor McGonagall knew what was on her mind, so she said, don't even think about asking Comey on the sly to make it for you, I already told him, and don't even think about asking for a drink at the 3 Broomsticks, Rosmerta won't give you drinks, and you don't have any money either. Minerva, you bad girl, Fish pouted and popped another piece of candy in his mouth. Leading Fish to the door of the 3 Broomsticks, Professor McGonagall reached out and pushed open the door to the bar. Despite Hogwarts being on vacation, it was still crowded, and Professor McGonagall glanced around the room before finding an empty table. As the 2 sat down at the empty table, the lovely landlady, Madame Rosmerta, approached just in time. Hello, Professor McGonagall, welcome. After greeting Professor McGonagall, Madame Rosmerta turned her attention to Fish. Is this the animagus you've adopted? He's so cute. Mrs. Rosmerta leaned over and reached out to touch Fish's head. Fish, who was already in a bad mood, pulled his head away from Mrs. Rosmerta's hand and bared his teeth at his, ha! But in both his human and feline forms, Fish's expression was so fierce that it frightened no one and elicited laughter from the wizards around him. Sorry, the boy's a bit shy, Professor McGonagall laughed and patted Fish's head. Mrs. Rosmerta didn't care about such trivia, she waved her hand to show she didn't care and asked, butterbeer? Or mead? I'll have a butterbeer. Professor McGonagall thought it would be safer to order a butterbeer, just in case naughty Fish stole a drink from her own glass, and a glass of cherry juice for Fish. Yes, please wait, Madame Rosmerta nodded to Professor McGonagall, winked at Fish, who was staring at her, and turned back to the bar. Just as she turned, however, she heard Fish's childish voice behind her, Minerva, this person is so weird. Fish gestured around his chest with a puzzled look. Why does he have a butt here? The noisy bar went silent for a moment, and after about 10 seconds or so, all the wizards in the bar burst out laughing. As they laughed wildly, many mages hit the table in front of them hard, and some mages even rolled off their chairs from laughing, fell to the floor and didn't bother to get up, lying on the floor and continued to laugh wildly while covering their stomachs. Fish looked at the laughing humans in confusion, not understanding what was wrong with their question. He had seen humans like that before, but he hadn't been able to become human at the time, so he hadn't paid much attention to them, and now he was seeing humans with a butt on their chests. Of course, he had to ask. That's not a butt." Professor McGonagall looked embarrassed, not knowing how to explain to Fish. After a long pause, she finally resorted to the more usual parental response, "You'll know when you're older." Chapter 15, School Starts. "And how old do I have to be to know, meow? When can I drink?" Undeterred by Professor McGonagall's perfunctory answer, Fish continued to ask relentlessly. Well, sort of. Not knowing how to answer this question, Professor McGonagall could only answer Fish's question vaguely. "Oh. Will I grow a butt here when I grow up?" Fish pointed to his chest again. The tavern crowd laughed even harder as Professor McGonagall replied stiffly, "It's only for girls, you won't get one when you grow up." Meow. Fish stared at Professor McGonagall's chest for half a second. "But don't you have a bottom, Minerva?" It was true that Professor McGonagall's bottom wasn't that obvious due to her ample wizarding robes and her age, but even if it wasn't, not many women would like to hear that from Fish. "Shut up." That's the end of the conversation, but Professor McGonagall couldn't be bothered with Fish's situation, so she cut off the conversation with a black face. Just then, Mrs. Rosmerta brought the butterbeer she wanted, and Professor McGonagall quickly took the glass and relied on drinking to disguise her embarrassment. Here's your cherry juice." Mrs. Rosmerta placed a glass of cherry juice in front of Fish. Although she was embarrassed by Fish's statement, Mrs. Rosmerta was not angry with him. It was nothing more than a thoughtless remark from a boy who had no idea what he was talking about, and in Lady Rosmerta's opinion, it was much more pleasant than the heavy jokes of the men who lusted after her body. Distracted by the cherry juice, Fish stopped teasing Professor McGonagall and stuck out his tongue, taking a careful sip of the crimson liquid in the glass. It was sweet and tasted good. Fish's eyes narrowed with satisfaction as his little tongue moved quickly, sending the liquid from the cup into his mouth. After habitually drinking some of the cherry juice with his tongue, Fish switched to the way humans drink, and when he lifted his head, he gulped down all of the juice. That said, the human form is much more convenient than the cat form when it comes to eating. Feeling a bit drowsy after finishing his glass of cherry juice, Fish transformed into a young silver tabby cat and jumped onto Professor McGonagall's lap to the amazement of the group of wizards. Probably fearing that Fish would ask his some embarrassing question, Professor McGonagall did not force Fish to remain human and let him rest on her lap. "I've kept you waiting, Minerva." As he slept, Fish suddenly heard a voice he hated and quickly got up from Professor McGonagall's lap. "Ha!" Jumping up on the table, Fish made an intimidating gesture arching his back at the white-bearded old man named Dumbledore. "Oh ho ho ho, so Fish is here." Dumbledore ignored Fish's hostility and bowed to greet him with a smile. Meow. Seeing Dumbledore's old face approaching, Fish jumped up irritably and smacked him on the nose, which was slightly crooked. Dumbledore had intended to let Fish vent his anger first, and then approach him. So instead of dodging Fish's claws, Dumbledore stepped forward, knowing that Fish was stronger than a normal cat. He had added protection with his magic. When he thought about it, no matter how strong the kitten was, his magic could hold. However, it turned out that Dumbledore was wrong. The vengeful Fish had added several spells to himself as soon as he appeared. The force of his slap far exceeded Dumbledore's estimation, and directly slapped the headmaster, causing his nose to bleed. "Merlin's fancy pants! What have you done, Fish?" The scene changed so quickly that it took a moment for Professor McGonagall to react, and he jumped to her feet, clutching her head and screaming. Meow. Seeing Professor McGonagall's reaction, Fish knew immediately that he was probably in trouble, and let out a dry howl in his defense, before turning his head and running out the window. At the time, Professor McGonagall was busy trying to help Dumbledore, who had fallen, and the other wizards were so shocked by what had just happened that no one reacted to stop Fish from running away. So Fish managed to get through the window of the three broomsticks and out of the bar. Wingardium Leviosa. Unfortunately, getting out of the bar was the limit, and Professor McGonagall had foreseen a similar situation, so she had hexed the shirt Fish had put on. On the premise that Fish had never learned anti-spell or defensive spells, Professor McGonagall could easily capture Fish who fled through the levitating spell. She dared Fish out of the house and, naturally, she was fully prepared. Meow, Fish, who had only run a few steps, felt his body float in the air, and then flew backwards to the 3 broomsticks, uncontrollably. Professor McGonagall reached out and grabbed the back of Fish's neck as he flew in front of her, lifting him up to her face and glaring at him fiercely. Fish, look what you've done. Meow. Fish, who was held in his hand, shrugged his 4 claws, his tail was stuck to his abdomen, his ears were drooped, and his big green eyes were looking innocently at the furious Professor McGonagall. He wasn't pretending to be pitiful, although he knew he was probably in trouble. Fish didn't understand exactly why he was in trouble. In Fish's mind, the old man with the white beard was the enemy, and it was only fair that he slapped him hard. Don't be angry, Minerva, he should be considered an enemy to this little guy. After stopping the bleeding from his nose, Dumbledore approached again, but this time he was much more careful, keeping his distance from Fish. At Dumbledore's reminder, Professor McGonagall remembered what Fish had been through before he was adopted, so it made sense for her to take a swipe at Dumbledore. Listen, Fish, Dumbledore is not the enemy, he's your future headmaster. Professor McGonagall put Fish back on the table and said earnestly. Meow, Fish looked at Dumbledore, only to see that the old man was looking down at himself with a smile on his face, just like when he had chased him. Ha, arching his back, puffing up his hair, bullying, all at once. The old man was not a good man. Professor McGonagall tried for a while, but she couldn't break Fish's hostility toward Dumbledore. She had no choice but to take Fish in her arms and pat him on the back, reassuring him while she talked to Dumbledore about Hogwarts. The meeting was mainly about teacher selection for next term's defense against the dark arts class, and after all these years, Dumbledore had very few people left, so today he had gone to see Professor McGonagall to see if she could recommend anyone. Embraced by Professor McGonagall, Fish didn't understand what they were talking about, but it was becoming increasingly clear to him that Minerva seemed to be friends with the mean old man. No wonder she was so angry. So, when you hit the old bad guy in the future, don't let Minerva see it. When Fish understood the logic, he stopped looking at Dumbledore and fell asleep in Professor McGonagall's arms. Since taking Fish out of the house, Professor McGonagall had taken him on a tour of Hogsmeade Village. The wizards of Hogsmeade knew Fish McGonagall as a born animagus, and the Daily Prophet even devoted a small section to the existence of this special young wizard to the entire British magical community. As time went on, Fish was able to communicate with people under the tutelage of Professor McGonagall. However, Fish was not very interested in becoming human or interacting with other humans, preferring mostly to stay at home, find a good place to sleep and sleep through the night. Unfortunately, Minerva has been so idle lately that she has been staying home, surprising Fish and trying to get him to learn all sorts of silly things, and not allowing him to turn back into a cat and lick his fur. It's just annoying. But luckily, Hogwarts is back in business. I'm free again. After finding that Minerva wasn't home in the morning, an excited Fish shed his clothes without a word, then transformed into a cat and scampered around the house. Poor Comey, the house elf, had to chase after him as he cleaned up the bottles and jars that Fish had deliberately knocked over. After knocking over everything he could, Fish went to his closet and tore all the clothes Minerva had laid out for him into rags. Finally, no more of this hassle. After destroying all his clothes, Fish went to sleep in the closet, resting on the remains of his clothes. In the evening, Professor McGonagall returned home from the Hogwarts commencement ceremony. When she opened the door with a smile on her face, she was greeted by the sight of the entire house in disarray and a house elf who was exhausted from her magic. As for the culprit, Fish, he had already found a place to hide when he noticed Professor McGonagall's return. Professor McGonagall's smile froze instantly. She took a deep breath. Fish McGonagall. Chapter 16, School is back in session. It is the beginning of another school year, and in a month's time, it will be the start of a new academic year at Hogwarts. Professor McGonagall has been through countless courses, but this year is still special, even for Professor McGonagall, the most senior professor at Hogwarts. Not only will Harry Potter, the boy who defeated Voldemort, enter Hogwarts this year, but her adopted son, Fish McGonagall, also received a letter of admission from Hogwarts yesterday. Fish, it's time for us to go. At Professor McGonagall's call, a silver tabby cat of about 13 inches jumped down from the second floor, circled twice in the air and transformed into a 10-year-old boy with silver hair and blue eyes, landing lightly on the ground. It had been almost 3 years since Professor McGonagall had adopted Fish, and under her tutelage, he had acquired a basic knowledge of the language and common sense of human society. At the very least, he had figured out the riddle of the butt and has gradually become accustomed to the human way of life. Although Fish still prefers his cat form, he is now less repulsed by the human form and clothing. Professor McGonagall sighed helplessly as she watched Fish leap down from the second floor. Although she taught Fish many things, he still retained many of his cat-like habits. Professor McGonagall had intended to wait for Fish's more normal behavior before admitting him to Hogwarts. But since Fish had received his Hogwarts admission letter this year, the old-fashioned Professor McGonagall wasn't about to break the old Hogwarts rules. As for Fish, he had heard the name Hogwarts more than once in the past 3 years, was still curious about the place and still didn't have a clear idea of what it meant to go to the school. He had seen schools in the Muggle world when he was a stray cat, and his understanding was that school was a place where a bunch of human puppies gathered to play. So when Professor McGonagall told Fish that he was going to school this year, the ignorant kitten agreed without much hesitation. Isn't it just a different place to play? That was something Fish was excited about. Are you going to Hogwarts, meow? Asked Fish excitedly as he landed in front of Professor McGonagall. No, we're just going to Diagon Alley today to buy you the necessary school supplies. Professor McGonagall had all the textbooks and cauldrons. After all, the basic Hogwarts curriculum hadn't changed in years, but she wanted to buy new things for Fish. Besides, the wand was absolutely indispensable. So a trip to Diagon Alley would be necessary. As for pets, Professor McGonagall thought that even if she bought one for Fish, the pet would turn up dead the next day, and would even go into Fish's stomach. Necessary? Is it good food? Fish asked. Fish was even more excited about this. It's the items on the list in the letter you got yesterday, Professor McGonagall added, but Diagon Alley has good food that you won't find in Hogsmeade Village. Then what are we waiting for? Fish immediately revived, tugged at Professor McGonagall's sleeve and ran for the door. Professor McGonagall staggered a few steps, steadied herself, and then gave Fish a good whack on the head. We'll go straight through with the flue dust, not the door. Flue dust? Asked Fish in confusion. It's that glowing powder you've thrown so many times, said Professor McGonagall. Meow, Fish immediately understood what the flue powder was. It was in a small clay pot, placed next to the fireplace, which he had not only knocked over several times, but also took the pot and spread the powder everywhere, causing Comey to bang his head against the wall for a long time. Professor McGonagall took Fish to the fireplace, scooped a pinch of powder out of the jar, and threw it into the fireplace. As she threw the powder into the fireplace, a green flame burst out of the darkness of the fireplace, the flames rising so high that they startled Fish, who was curiously close by. Don't worry, the flames from the gunpowder won't hurt anyone. Professor McGonagall reached into the fireplace and shook it a couple of times, before pulling her unharmed arm out and showing it to Fish. All you have to do is shout the name of the leaky cauldron as you enter, then close your eyes and wait for the fire to take you to your destination. Professor McGonagall explained to Fish how to use the flue powder, and that she had chosen the leaky cauldron as the destination because there were several chimney exits in Diagon Alley and she was worried that Fish might choose the wrong one. Therefore, it is safe to use the leaky cauldron, even if it takes longer due to the busy flue network. I'll give you a demonstration, and remember, say it clearly, leaky cauldron, said Professor McGonagall as she stepped into the flames of the fireplace and disappeared in the blink of an eye. As Professor McGonagall disappeared, the turquoise flames of the fireplace quickly died down, returning to their previous blackened state. Meow? Minerva, carefully poking his head into the fireplace, Fish sniffed with his nose. However, there was no trace of Professor McGonagall's scent there, except for the choking smell of soot. Master Fish, Professor McGonagall should have arrived at the leaky cauldron by now. The house elf, Comey, came to Fish's side and explained politely. Oh! Fish's eyes flashed as he looked over the fireplace at the clay pot with the flue powder. He. That, young Master Fish, if you say other names, you're likely to be sent to strange places. After almost 3 years of living together, Comey knew Fish's character well enough to warn him in time. If you go somewhere else, Professor McGonagall won't be able to buy you anything to eat. Bah! Fish pouted his lips sadly, but finally gave up on running away to another place. After all, it was more important to eat. Following Minerva's example, he took a small pinch of the powder from the jar and dropped it into the fireplace in front of him, which was again ablaze with green flames. Dipping into the green flames curiously, Fish closed his eyes and shouted, "Leaky cauldron." Opening his mouth, Fish felt a blast of hot air with a strong smell of smoke and fire in his throat, which almost prevented him from finishing the sentence. He opened his eyes unconsciously and saw a variety of doors flashing in front of him. Even with his dynamic cat vision he could only see a glimpse of them, and the deafening ringing in his ears irritated him greatly. Just as Fish was about to jump through a random door, the falling sensation suddenly disappeared and Fish felt as if someone had pushed him from behind, shoving him through a door. As soon as he was through the door, he was grabbed by Professor McGonagall, who was waiting for him outside, but even without Professor McGonagall, it was unlikely he would have fallen. "I don't like this one, meow." Fish gave a loud shake as he stepped out of the fireplace, shaking all the soot off his body, and then muttered a complaint to Professor McGonagall, "This flue dust isn't comfortable at all." Professor McGonagall ignored Fish's complaint as she patted the soot off Fish's body, took Fish's hand and walked out. "Now we'll have breakfast at the Leaky Cauldron and then go to Diagon Alley to buy the items on our list." Hearing that there was food, Fish immediately stopped complaining, "But Minerva, the list you mentioned, seems to have been shredded by me yesterday." Chapter 17, Diagon Alley. The lack of a list wasn't really a problem. Not to mention the fact that Professor McGonagall already knew what young wizards needed for each year of school, and that asking around the stores in Diagon Alley would give her an idea of what to buy. Professor McGonagall chastised Fish with a gentle smack on the head, then led him into the lobby of the Leaky Cauldron. Once again, there were familiar but uninteresting compliments, and questions from strange wizards about Fish's identity. Anyway, Fish didn't even listen to them, he was still hungry. "Breakfast for me and Fish, Tom." After greeting her acquaintances in the foyer, Professor McGonagall beckoned to Tom, the bar head. Tom responded, turned and went to the back of the kitchen, and returned shortly with 2 plates, placing them in front of Professor McGonagall and Fish. Staring at, poking his finger into the baked dough and raw liver on the plate, Fish looked at Professor McGonagall with a sour look. "This is what you call good food? Minerva is a real liar." Professor McGonagall felt a little embarrassed by Fish's look, so she cleared her throat and whispered reassuringly, "Eat something to fill your stomach and I'll buy you something delicious when we get to Diagon Alley." After glaring at Professor McGonagall, Fish decided to trust his again, grabbed the pancake off the plate and bit into it angrily. Although it didn't look like much, the baked batter tasted pretty good, except that Fish preferred meat to it. So he set the pancake down half-eaten, picked up his fork and popped a piece of raw liver into his mouth. The taste was surprisingly good, and it actually still tasted good for meat. Meow, with eyes narrowed in delight, Fish quickly swept the raw liver off his plate, then took the remaining half of the pancake and dipped it into the raw liver broth. Once they had eaten and drunk enough, Professor McGonagall led Fish across the bar of the Leaky Cauldron to a small courtyard with walls on all sides. Here there was nothing but a garbage can and some weeds. "Fish, you must remember the next steps." Professor McGonagall walked over to the single trash can and pulled out her wand. "Count 3 up, then 2 sideways, then tap this brick 3 times. She demonstrated to Fish, drawing a circle around a battered-looking brick before tapping it 3 times with the wand. The struck brick began to shake and move, and a small hole appeared in the center of the wall and grew larger. Before long, a wide archway appeared before them. Fish looked along the archway, at the other end of which was a winding, endless street of cobblestones. "Come on," Professor McGonagall inclined her head to Fish and led the way into the archway, followed quickly by Fish, who kept turning his head and looking around in amazement. As soon as the two crossed the archway, it turned back into a wall behind them. As they entered Diagon Alley, the first store was a cauldron store, where Professor McGonagall quickly bought a standard-size 2 pewter crucible and then led Fish to the next store. It didn't take long for the quick Professor McGonagall to buy Fish textbooks, cauldrons, scales, telescopes, and the largest ice cream she could find at the Florian Fortescue ice cream parlor to calm Fish, who kept looking in the direction of the magical animal shop. "Then all that's left is the uniform and the wand." Professor McGonagall counted on her fingers and pulled Fish toward Madame Malkin's store, robes for all occasions. "Minerva, that store looks interesting." Meow, forcibly dragged, Fish pointed to the magical joke store not far away, where, through the window, he could see the magical fireworks on display. Professor McGonagall didn't listen to him. She had enough trouble with Fish when he was a kitten, what if he had access to the wares of the magic joke store? She even avoided taking Fish to Zunco's joke store in Hogsmeade. The Weasley twins were nothing compared to this little guy. The idea that Fish would probably meet George and Fred once school started made Professor McGonagall less willing to have him assigned to Gryffindor. The process of buying his uniform went smoothly, and Fish was so used to wearing human clothes that he endured the tedious process of Mrs. Malkin stroking his body with a tape measure. Minerva had promised him a large ice cream when he was finished. After buying his uniform from Mrs. Malkin, Professor McGonagall kept her word and took Fish back to the Florian Fortescue ice cream parlor for another great ice cream before taking him to the last stop on his journey in Diagon Alley. The store that almost every wizard in England must visit once in their life, Ollivander's Wand Shop. Located at the far end of Diagon Alley, the store looks small and shabby, with a peeling gold sign above the door that reads, Ollivander, making fine wands since 382 BC. In the dusty window, a wand stood alone on a faded purple cushion. Fish followed Professor McGonagall inside the store, which, aside from a bench, consisted of numerous long, narrow boxes stacked to the ceiling. After glancing around the store, Fish suddenly turned his head to the right and looked toward the back of the store, hidden by the countless boxes. Suddenly there was the tinkling of a bell. Good morning, an old man with white hair and eyebrows, even his eyes were white as silver, came out from the back and approached Fish and Professor McGonagall. Hello, Mr. Ollivander, Professor McGonagall smiled and replied with a nod to Garrick Ollivander. Oh, it's you, Miss McGonagall, what a delightful meeting, spruce wood, 9.5 inches, hard and perfect for transformations. Mr. Ollivander's voice was soft as he winked at Professor McGonagall. I take it you are very pleased. Of course, I couldn't be more pleased, said Professor McGonagall. That's good, that's good. Mr. Ollivander nodded happily, and then looked at Fish. So, this is the child you adopted? Yes, I brought him here to choose a wand. After all, there is no better wand store in England, Professor McGonagall said with a nod. Mr. Ollivander, whose smile was reinforced by Professor McGonagall's praise, pulled a long tape measure with a silver scale from his coat pocket and asked Fish in a soft voice, and, Mr. Fish McGonagall, what is your usual hand? Meow. Fish looked at his hands, cocked his head to one side for a moment and then raised his left hand in the air, this one. You don't need to raise it so high, come, spread your arms. Mr. Ollivander placed the tape measure on Fish's shoulder, and it moved on its own around Fish's body. First from shoulder to fingertips, then from wrist to elbow, from shoulder to floor, from knee to armpit, even the circumference of his head and even the distance between his nostrils, the tape measure spared nothing. Fish resisted the instinct to play the tape measure, which ran back and forth across his body. As much as he wanted to pick up the tape measure and play with it, he wanted a magic wand more. For it was with this little wooden stick, called a wand, that Minerva had cast all those strange spells she had used to rule over him. So Fish thought more than once that if one day he had a wand, then Minerva would have no control over him. By this time, Mr. Ollivander had pulled several long boxes from the various shelves and stacked them haphazardly at Fish's feet. Very well, Mr. Ollivander pocketed the tape measure, which he had finished measuring and had balled up on the floor, and handed Fish a wand from one of the stacks of boxes. Try this, Mr. McGonagall. It's the same wand as Professor McGonagall's, spruce wood and fire dragon heart fiber, and just as hard, but longer than Minerva's, 12 inches. Try waving it. Fish picked up the wand, which was said to be of the same material as Minerva's, and instead of following Mr. Ollivander's instructions to wield it, he held it in front of his eyes for a moment, and then, took a bite. Chapter 18, Fish's Wand. In fact, Fish knew that doing so was probably wrong. Unfortunately, he couldn't resist. Luckily, as Mr. Ollivander had said, the wand was actually very hard, and Fish's bite left only a light coating of teeth marks. But the wand seemed to be irritated by it, and a white light burst frantically from the tip of the wand, hitting the shelves next to it and blowing the boxes to smithereens. Protego, Professor McGonagall pulled out her wand and cast a protection spell to stop the white light from shooting out, while Mr. Ollivander snatched the wand from Fish's mouth as fast as he could. Whether the wand was suitable for Fish or not, it certainly wasn't going to do him any good later this cast. Fish. A wand is not a cat toothpick. It's not for biting, Professor McGonagall scolded the cat boy, as she ducked her head and bowed to Mr. Ollivander apologetically. I'm so sorry, Mr. Ollivander, the boy still has some habits he hasn't kicked. It's okay, I understand. Mr. Ollivander stroked the wand in pain, then looked at Fish who was still looking confused, pretending, and let out a long sigh before not pursuing the matter any further. Just don't do it again, Not all wands are as hard as this one, Mr. Ollivander said. Did you hear that, Fish? Said Professor McGonagall sternly. Meow. Nodded Fish. Mr. Ollivander forgave the young man, despite his distaste for his earlier behavior. Fish had an affinity for animals that most people, even Dumbledore, let alone Ollivander, could not easily resent. Besides, Mr. Ollivander, who knew Fish's origins, considered him justified, and if any other wizard had dared to do so, Mr. Ollivander would not have done business with him again, even if he had been the son of the Minister of Magic. So the selection of wands continued. Mr. Ollivander picked up a wand, thought about it, handed it back, pulled another from the bottom of the box, and carefully handed it to Fish. Carpe, Phoenix Quill, 11 1/3 inches, characterized by. Well, very hard. This time Fish did nothing else, took the wand and waved it, nothing happened. Mr. Ollivander, relieved, quickly took the wand out of his hand, then took the one he had put back. Ebony, unicorn hair, 8.5 inches, very flexible, please be careful, it's not as hard as the first two wands. Mr. Ollivander handed the wand to Fish after a few tips. This time there was a reaction to Fish's movement, a flicker of light on the tip of the wand that might have been lost if he had not been careful, but that was all. This response did not satisfy Mr. Ollivander, who removed the wand and replaced it with a new one, black walnut, thunderbird tail feathers, 9 inches, not very controllable, but very popular with shapeshifters, not too hard either. Buzz. There was a flash, and this time the reaction was a little stronger, but Mr. Ollivander was still not satisfied. Mahogany, unicorn tail hair, 13 inches, flexible, perfect for shape-shifting, influenced, it seemed, by Fish's natural animagus status. Mr. Ollivander's choice of address focused on transfiguration. Well, except for the Carpe wand. The reaction to the first two wands made Mr. Ollivander think he was on the right track. As a result, the moment Fish grabbed the mahogany wand, Mr. Ollivander realized that his assumption was wrong. Without waiting for Fish to wave his wand, he snatched it away, shaking his head at the same time. Looks like we're going in the wrong direction. Mr. Ollivander rummaged through a pile of boxes for a while before finding a wand and placing it in Fish's hands. Purple clover, heart nerve of a fire dragon, 10 2/3 inches, a very powerful wand. Fish waved it, and it crackled with sparks. This one's no good either, said Mr. Ollivander. The wand was withdrawn from his hand again, and Fish grew impatient. Minerva, Fish looked at Professor McGonagall with pursed lips. You must be patient, my dear, Professor McGonagall said in a reassuring tone, the choice of wand is too important for a wizard to neglect. But this is really boring. Fish was a bit bored, at first caught up in the strange light effects, but after a while he got bored with the tedious wand movements. Oh! I see. Mr. Ollivander seemed to be inspired by their conversation and, instead of searching through the pile of boxes at his feet, resumed his search of the shelves. Here, try this one, made of sycamore wood, for the curious teacher, with the core of a phoenix tail feather, 9 inches. Fish, who had lost his initial enthusiasm, waved it nonchalantly and, while nothing happened, Mr. Ollivander's eyes lit up and he snapped his hands. That's it. And then he switched his wand for Fish to try. Meow. Fish had no patience for anything he wasn't interested in, and if he hadn't wanted a wand, he would have lost his temper and run away. After trying several wands back and forth, Fish's mind became irritated and his face twitched, while Mr. Ollivander looked happier and happier. For a wand maker, the more demanding the customer, the more rewarding it is to satisfy them. I think we're very close to the final answer. Mr. Ollivander could see Fish's impatience and, as he repositioned the wand, he stopped Fish from taking another bite of his wand. Perhaps this is it. Mr. Ollivander pulled out a wand made from several tangled reeds and handed it to Fish. Vine wood, 12 inches, with a core of cat and leopard hair, which I bought from the Appalachian Cherokee to try out different wands, and which Johannes Jonker, the American wand maker, liked to use as a wand core, and which, after several attempts, I decided that phoenix feathers, unicorn hair and the heart sinews of a fire dragon were the best materials for a wand core. When it comes to wand making, Mr. Ollivander can't stop talking. Although I no longer use cat and leopard hair as a wand core, this wand is still one of my best creations, from material to technique. Despite Ollivander's rhetoric, Fish had no interest. He took the wand in his hand and was about to wave it as he had done before when he suddenly felt a warmth in the hand that held the wand. Unconsciously, he swung his arm in the direction of the power. As he waved his arm, the entire store was enveloped in a vibrant green light, new branches sprouted from the wooden shelves and benches and quickly grew and spread, hanging down with cascades of green leaves, and instantly transforming the old, ramshackle store into a lush, green place. "That's it!" Mr. Ollivander shouted excitedly, "There'll never be a better wand for you, Mr. McGonagall. Vinewood is more sensitive than any wand made of wood when it comes to being an instant match for the wand master." Mr. Ollivander excitedly explained to Fish and Professor McGonagall, "I have witnessed 2 similar scenes, this is the third, and they were invariably made of vine wood." Fish, who had no interest in wand knowledge, played with the wand in his hands with delight. The silver-eyed old man was a bit grumpy, but he had a knack for picking out wands. With the wand in his hand, Fish looked at Minerva, who was paying Mr. Ollivander, and remembered the spell he had cast on her. Wingardium Leviosa. Professor McGonagall turned to Fish, who was pointing his wand at her, looking confused. "Very good pronunciation, my dear Fish, it's just that spells don't just have to be shouted, but don't worry, we have a month before classes start and in that time I will teach you a lot about spells." Professor McGonagall crouched down in front of Fish with a soft smile on her face, stroked her head gently and said softly. However, Fish felt a shiver run down his spine, and if he were in his cat form, all his fur would have bristled. Fish blinked twice, quickly removed his wand from his hand, slumped to the floor, and then lifted up his shirt, exposing his belly to Professor McGonagall with an ingratiating smile on his face. Meow. Chapter 19, The Trip to Hogsmeade Station. Harry Potter, who just turned 11, had an unforgettable and fantastic birthday recently when he learned that both he and his parents were wizards on his 11th birthday. And that there was a wizarding school called Hogwarts that accepted young wizards like him to learn how to use magic. They even used owls to deliver letters of admission. After his first contact with the wizarding world in Diagon Alley, Harry Potter had been looking forward to the opening day of the school, which had been completely unthinkable in the past. He was no better off at school than he was at home due to his cousin Dally's deliberate isolation. On the first day of September, Harry Potter finally arrived with great trepidation and anticipation and, with the help of the enthusiastic Weasley family, magically made his way through the walls of the train station, to platform 9 3/4 and onto the train that would take him to Hogwarts. On the train, he met several young wizards, both friendly and annoying, who were also new students. Through the introduction of these young wizards, Harry finally understood a bit of things related to the magical world, although this understanding was very partial. As the sky darkened, Harry's train was about to arrive at its destination. Harry Potter, along with his new friend, Ron Weasley, whom he had just met, followed the crowd and exited the train as the train pulled into the station, onto a small, dark platform. Through the dim light, Harry could barely make out the words Hogsmeade Station on a wooden sign next to it. As the two wondered what to do next, Harry suddenly heard a familiar, friendly voice from the distance. "First years! First years, come this way!" shouted Hagrid, a lantern in his hand, his massive frame standing out in the crowd of young wizards, and all the first years heard his shout and began to move in his direction. Harry and Ron were no exception. "Is that a little wizard sitting on that big man's shoulder?" Ron rubbed his eyes and nudged Harry, unsure. Through the dim light, Harry saw a figure about his size sitting on one of Hagrid's shoulders, who seemed to notice Harry's stare and suddenly turned his head to meet his and Ron's eyes. Both were startled, for the other's eyes were cat-like and reflected a greenish glow in the dark atmosphere. The little wizard on Hagrid's shoulder was, of course, Fish. Because of his performance in Diagon Alley, Professor McGonagall was unsure about putting him on the Hogwarts Express that she cancelled her plans to put him through the entire Hogwarts admissions process. However, the route to Hogwarts Castle for new students had been established by the 4 founders when the school was founded, so, after some thought, Professor McGonagall handed Fish over to Hagrid to follow the other new students from the back of the line to Hogwarts. During her years in Professor McGonagall's care, occasional wizards occasionally visited the house, among them Rubeus Hagrid, a large man whom Fish always remembered well because of his hairy body. And the also hairy and evil Dumbledore, after giving Fish a few looks, was able to get along. "Harry, come here, how are you?" Hagrid followed Fish's gaze and saw Harry not far away. He smiled and waved at Harry. Harry raised his hand and waved twice, then bowed to Hagrid with Ron. As they got closer, they could see the little wizard on Hagrid's shoulder. Silver grey hair, the same green eyes as Harry's and a small, round face, at first glance, aroused goodwill. The little wizard was wrestling with a tough-looking piece of pancake, and his adorable appearance drew murmurs from the little witches around him, and even the boys couldn't help but stare at him. "Come on, follow me, any other first years? Watch your feet. First years, follow me." Hagrid scanned the platform for other young wizards, and headed down a steep, narrow path with his lantern. The path was steep and slippery, and Hagrid's lantern had limited illumination, so many stumbled, and no one had time to speak, save for the occasional sobs from Neville, who had lost his toad, and the sound of Fish nibbling on the hard pancake. "Turn this corner and you'll soon see Hogwarts for the first time." Hagrid, who had been leading the way up the steep path for a while, suddenly turned to the wizards and shouted. All the young wizards breathed a sigh of relief and let out a loud cheer in unison. At the end of the road, a black lake appeared before the little wizards, and on the opposite shore of the lake, on the upper slope, stood an imposing castle. "No more than 4 people in each boat," shouted Hagrid, pointing to a group of boats moored on the shore, and the young wizards, hearing this, chose the same boat as their familiar companions. "Are you all aboard?" Hagrid confirmed, as he guided Fish into the front boat. "Well, then. Let's get going." Most of the young wizards were lost in the view, silently gazing at the towering castle in the distance, except Fish, who was on his back, resting his chin on the edge of the boat, staring unblinkingly at the black surface of the lake. "Are there many fish in this lake, big man?" "How do they know?" Fish turned to Hagrid after watching the black lake for a while. He could already smell his prey. Although Fish was used to cooked food by now, he hadn't lost his hunting instinct, and the little things swimming under the quiet lake made Fish a little excited. Unlike other cats, Fish was not afraid of water and even enjoyed swimming. "Don't do anything stupid," Hagrid, who knew how unpredictable the little guy was, held him down. If he hadn't been held, the little wizard would have jumped into the lake to fish. Hagrid had promised Professor McGonagall that he would keep an eye on Fish. "When the opening ceremony is over, Hogwarts will provide you with dinner. There is plenty of delicious food there, all prepared by the house elves at Hogwarts. You don't need to fish yourself," Hagrid said. Good thing Hagrid had a good relationship with Fish and knew how to appease the little guy. "All right then." With a lingering glance at the fish swimming under the lake, Fish licked his lips, then thought about Comey's cooking and finally gave up the idea of going into the water to fish. Chapter 20, Talking Heads. The fleet rowed across the mirror-like lake, taking the young wizards through a curtain of ivy that covered the front of the cliff, through a dark tunnel, and finally to a sort of subway dock. They all disembarked, and Neville found his lost toad in the process. Hagrid continued to lead the way with his flashlight, this time reversing the direction he had taken earlier and starting to climb. Fish didn't bother wasting his energy, he plopped back down on Hagrid's shoulders and comfortably wiggled his little legs. "Why does he get to ride that big git, and I have to make my own way?" Draco Malfoy muttered sadly. Even with the help of Goyle and Crabbe, the ride had left the young master in a bit of a pickle. Sharp-eared Fish heard Malfoy's complaint and turned his head to look at the light blonde-haired boy, remembering what Minerva had told him, "Get along with the other young wizards." So Fish wiggled his hips and turned around. He sat back on Hagrid's shoulders, waving his arms at Malfoy. "Hey! Do you want to sit here too?" Malfoy froze at Fish's sudden words, his pale cheeks flushed as he felt the strange looks coming from all around him. "No, that's not necessary," Malfoy waved his hand and then lowered his head willingly. "Are you all right?" Malfoy, Crabbe asked, a little concerned. As one of his followers, it was the first time he had seen Malfoy speak nicely to anyone. Although Crabbe himself had an inexplicable affection for the boy, his limited intellect couldn't make sense of the connection. "What could be wrong with me?" Malfoy immediately reverted to his old ways as he faced his follower, raising his head proudly and turning his nostrils towards Crabbe. In fact, Malfoy himself was a little confused. He had intended to taunt the young wizard, but for some reason the words wouldn't come out, and he had somehow politely denied them. Before Malfoy knew it, however, the new students had arrived at a huge oak door, led by Hagrid. "Are we all here? Look, you still have your toad, don't you?" Hagrid made one last check of the number of people, and a quick glance at Neville's toad, before raising his huge fist and slamming it 3 times on the castle door. The door opened immediately and a tall witch in emerald green robes stood behind it, her black hair pulled back in a high ponytail, her stern look adding to the nervousness of the small group of wizards. Just then, a voice broke the tension. "Minerva! I'm hungry, when can we eat?" Fish, sitting on Hagrid's shoulder with a relaxed look on his face, waved his arms excitedly and shouted to Professor McGonagall as soon as he saw her figure. Professor McGonagall looked at Fish, sitting on Hagrid's shoulder, and immediately her serious expression softened, but her words were still stern, "Get off, Hagrid. And call me Professor McGonagall at school." "Yes, Minerva, no problem, Minerva," Fish replied with a smile as he jumped off Hagrid's shoulder. Professor McGonagall did not continue her conversation with Fish, but instead nodded to Hagrid, "Thank you, Hagrid. I'll take it from here." The group of young wizards followed Professor McGonagall through the castle gates, all of them consciously keeping a small distance from her. Only the restless Fish ran up to Professor McGonagall and reached out to tug at the sleeve of her robes, only to be hit in the head with a slap. "Get back in line." The corners of Professor McGonagall's mouth twitched slightly and she whispered to Fish. "Oh." Fish covered his head with his hands and pouted as he turned back to the group, his small expression of resignation eliciting a chorus of "So cute and I really want to hug him" from the young witches. Even among the boys, Harry could faintly hear similar exclamations. Professor McGonagall led the first years into a small empty room and briefly mentioned the house sorting ceremony and the 4 houses of Hogwarts that would take place later. "What about dinner?" asked Fish. "Never mind the ceremony." Fish's attention was focused on the food. "Dinner will be arranged after the ceremony." Professor McGonagall gave Fish a stern look, and answered her question seriously. "Without the temptation of food, it would be foolish to try to keep the boy here in peace. When I'm ready, I'll come and get you." Professor McGonagall looked at Fish and gave her a warning look, "Please be quiet while you wait." With that, Professor McGonagall left the room, and the group of young wizards immediately began talking amongst themselves. The most talked about, apart from the sorting ceremony, was the apparently very special student, Harry Potter, the famous savior, whose scar was covered by his hair, so only a few knew he was there. When Professor McGonagall left, Fish ran unseen to the door and peeked through the crack. "Do you know what's going on with him?" After getting even more nervous talking to Ron about the sorting ceremony, Harry thought it would be best to change the subject and lighten the mood. "I don't know, he's probably Professor McGonagall's son from earlier." Ron shook his head, making a guess that was immediately obvious to everyone. Minerva McGonagall, head of Gryffindor House, Transfiguration teacher, one of the 7 animagus of the century, has no children. Hermione Granger, who was still reciting the incantation in a whisper, suddenly interjected, "I read about her in important magical events of the 20th century. It's the nephew or something." Ron's cheek twitched twice, as if he felt a little embarrassed that he had less knowledge than a witch from a Muggle family, and he interrupted impatiently, "That's not the point. Can I ask, what is an animagus?" Harry asked his question before Ron and Hermione got into an argument. "Animagus is a very, very difficult spell." Hermione seemed especially excited at the mention of it, "a spell that allows a wizard to become whatever animal suits him or her best. It usually takes years of practice to become an animagus, and in the 20th century, there have only been 7 animagus registered with the Ministry of Magic." Hermione's words were full of admiration for Professor McGonagall. "That would be 8 now." Ron disliked Hermione's good student attitude, which reminded him of his own brilliant siblings, so he didn't hesitate to interject, "I remember 2 or 3 years ago, in the Daily Prophet had a story about the discovery of an animagus from birth. And coincidentally, not too far away, Draco Malfoy said the same thing." "I think I know who he is," Malfoy deigned in his leisurely tone to those around him. "He's a young wizard that Minerva McGonagall adopted a few years ago, a natural-born animagus." Chapter 21, Classification Ceremony. As much as Harry disliked the arrogant and obnoxious Draco Malfoy, he sharpened his ear when he heard Malfoy talk about Fish. And Malfoy enjoyed the attention so much, so he raised his voice and told them everything he knew about Fish. "My father told me that Professor McGonagall adopted a boy a few years ago, a boy who was found living as a stray cat in the Muggle world, and then somehow Headmaster Dumbledore discovered him and brought him back, because Professor McGonagall's animagus was also a cat, and so he was given to her to raise." After telling Fish's origin story, Malfoy smacked his lips, though there is speculation that his parents might have both been Muggles and that's why they kicked him out of fear. But how is that possible? Malfoy sneered scornfully, "How can a Muggle family produce such a natural animagus? He's at least half-blood, but the likelihood of him being a pure-blood is higher." With that, Malfoy raised his head proudly, seemingly certain that Fish was a pure-blood wizard, and his gaze swept over the smaller wizards who were not pure-bloods in a blatant display of his superiority. The few pure-bloods standing next to Malfoy had the same look. However, most of the younger wizards didn't really care if Fish was a pure-blood or not, they were more interested in what Fish had been through. Merlin's cotton socks. "He's so pathetic," I'd love to give him a hug. Stray cats, it's unbelievable. Good thing Mr. Headmaster found him. Some of the younger witches even burst into tears, wiping their tears with their sleeves and looking at Fish with growing tenderness. Harry gave the young wizard an equally sympathetic look, feeling lucky compared to what he was going through. At least he had a roof over his head, and 3 meals a day to fill his stomach. Fish, who was peering through the crack in the door, suddenly a shiver running down his back, and he jerked his head back to see a group of young wizards looking at him quizzically. Meow, Fish cocked his head, looking puzzled. The result was another scream from a group of little witches. Strange human beings, after a few moments of looking at them, and finding that they did nothing but stare at him, Fish ignored them and began to look around the room. The young wizards did not bother him and watched as Fish paced the room at an unrecognizable pace. Just as Fish had gone halfway across the room, a group of silvery, translucent humans suddenly jumped out of the walls around him. One of them passed through Fish's body, making him shiver. Meow, believing he was being attacked, Fish instinctively lashed out. And rightly so, he missed. Hey! Rude boy, although unharmed, the ghost was still surprised, scowling at Fish and the other young mages. What are you guys doing here? Without waiting for the others to say anything, he patted his head with a start. Ah, right, the sorting ceremony, so you're new to this year? Hey, don't try to catch me, I'm a ghost. A ghost, you know. As the ghost spoke, Fish kept waving his hands, trying to catch the strange human in front of him. Meow? A ghost? What's that? Fish blinked and asked curiously, but the 2 little hands kept waving restlessly. Merlin's woolen hat. Don't young wizards know about ghosts anymore? Or are you the son of a muggle family? The ghost replied angrily, wide-eyed, a ghost is someone who's dead. But you're still moving, meow, Fish replied, as he continued to pull the ghost with his hands. Yes, I can still move, but that doesn't mean I'm still alive. The obsession of the dead to stay in the world produces ghosts. Stop, the ghost, who had been depressed when answering Fish's question about his condition, found that Fish didn't even listen to him, but kept pulling himself along. He suddenly ignored the melancholy and immediately became violent again. After a few dozen scratches, Fish realized that he could not touch the other party, but only left his paws cold, so he obediently withdrew his hand. The ghost was about to have a good old-fashioned argument with Fish, but then Professor McGonagall returned. Now move along, the ceremony is about to begin. And Fish, stop bothering the ghosts and get back here. Professor McGonagall was at the door, shouting at the first years in a high-pitched voice. With Professor McGonagall's return, the ghosts stopped loitering and disappeared through the wall, while Fish quickly ran to Professor McGonagall's side. Get back into single file with them, Professor McGonagall said, looking at Fish and pointing to the other young wizards, and then follow me, and after the sorting ceremony, it will be time for dinner. And so Fish moved back to the front of the little wizards, his body swaying restlessly and gently in anticipation of the meal that was to follow. The group of eager young wizards followed Professor McGonagall and Fish down the hall and into a magnificent auditorium. At the long table at the top of the room, Fish saw several familiar faces. Bad old man. The little man. The fat ant and the wooden leg. I'm here. Fish stood on tiptoe, waving his hands, and greeted Albus Dumbledore, Phileas Flitwick, Pomona Sprout, and Sylvanus Kettleben in a loud voice. They were all professors who had been guests of McGonagall's house, and had been there more than once, and Fish had gotten to know them well. All the professors who were called waved their hands cheerfully in response to him. Fish wanted to run over to chat with them, but Professor McGonagall grabbed him by the collar and pulled him back. Fish looked back in confusion, as he had told him to get along with the mean old man when they were at home. However, seeing the look on Professor McGonagall's face, which was about to shoot fire, he returned to the line without a word. When the seniors saw this scene, they gathered together and began to whisper, and the originally silent auditorium immediately became a bit noisy. Silence, Professor McGonagall glared angrily at the initiator and then spoke to silence the students' conversation. You, go stand over there, line up. When the auditorium was silent again, Professor McGonagall directed all the freshmen to stand in front of the long teacher's table, lined up in front of all the seniors, and then placed a four-legged stool and a battered, pointy wizard's hat in front of them. Just as the freshmen were confused, the hat opened a wide slit and began to sing. You may not think I'm pretty, but you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. If you can find a nicer hat than me. Hey, what are you doing, little one? Chapter 22, Pursuit in the Great Dining Hall. It was the first time this had happened to the Sorting Hat. Only at the beginning of his song, a little wizard jumped up and grabbed it in his hands. Minerva! What a funny hat! I want it. No one else could have done such a thing than Fish, who, grabbing the Sorting Hat and holding it up, shouted gleefully to Professor McGonagall. Fish! Put that hat down now. Professor McGonagall was furious, although she had prepared herself for the fact that Fish, the little kitten, was going to be a lot of trouble when she started school. Just because Fish had been behaving a little out of character, but generally obedient, Professor McGonagall had let her guard down a little. She had not expected Fish to jump up at that moment and interfere with the Hogwarts selection ceremony. Professor McGonagall arched her eyebrows and pointed to the four-legged stool held by the Sorting Hat. You can't have this, hurry up and give it back. Noticing how angry Minerva seemed to be, Fish felt conflicted, interested in the talking hat, but worried that Minerva might lecture him. As Fish hesitated, the twig hat in his hand spoke. I must congratulate you, little one, on your good sense. But alas, I cannot go with you. Finding a house to which the young wizards of Hogwarts belong was a task given to me by the four founders back then. But when it's your turn, I can let you carry it for a while longer. For now, give me back, I haven't finished my song yet. Fish looked at Minerva, who was furious, and then at the hat that was chattering in his hand. He grabbed the Sorting Hat, turned and ran. He wanted the hat more than anything, and if Minerva wanted to be angry, so be it, it wouldn't be the first time. Petrificus Totalis, Professor McGonagall, who knew Fish's temperament well, pulled out her wand almost as soon as she turned around. But Fish had also accumulated a lot of experience in his confrontations against Professor McGonagall, and when he heard his voice, he didn't even look back. His body suddenly shrank and turned into a half-meter-long tabby cat. Immediately after, Professor McGonagall's spell grazed Fish's scalp and hit a hapless ghost, who fell down stunned. Sorry, Holden. Professor McGonagall waved her wand and lifted the ghost's spell. Break it up, I have some family business to take care of. The ghosts and the students around them left the long table and retreated to the edge of the auditorium, while most of the professors talked, laughed, and mingled. Even Snape and the others, who did not know Fish, chose to watch in silence. Fish arrived at the door with the Sorting Hat in his mouth, and after scratching it twice with his paws and realizing he couldn't open it, he immediately turned back. Taking advantage of the cover of the still-moving crowd, Fish ducked under the long table that belonged to the Ravenclaw. Wingardium Leviosa. Once the students retreated to the edge of the auditorium, leaving it empty, Professor McGonagall used a floating spell to lift the Ravenclaw table. However, the table was empty underneath. I'm here. At this moment, the Sorting Hat's shout was heard from above, and everyone looked up, only to discover that Fish was hanging upside down under the long table, and the Sorting Hat was still firmly clamped in his mouth. Carpe retractum, a thick rope shot out from the tip of Professor McGonagall's wand, heading straight for Fish, who dodged it with ease. But as soon as he hit the ground, several stools turned into cats his size and pounced on him. Fish didn't bother with his false counterparts and addressed the crowd with the Sorting Hat in his mouth. Petrificus Totalis. Petrificus Totalis. Petrificus Totalis. Sparks flew from Professor McGonagall's wand, one blocking Fish's path, one blocking his back, and one heading straight for him. Fish twisted, transforming from cat to human, clutching his Sorting Hat in one hand and his own wand in the other. Protogo. The Protogo charm bounced off Professor McGonagall's barrier spell, and Fish took advantage of his daze to wave his wand again, casting a floating spell at the fake cats. Wingardium Leviosa. Fish had not been lazy in the last month, he had learned a lot of spells without Professor McGonagall knowing, just so he could surprise his one day. Professor McGonagall was surprised, but not happy. In the meantime, she had tried to teach Fish some basic spells, but the boy had pretended not to understand them or had turned into a cat and hid. So Professor McGonagall had thought it was because Fish hadn't gotten used to them yet, but she hadn't realized that the boy had already learned them. But when she thought about how Fish had behaved since he had been given his wand in Ollivander's store, Professor McGonagall didn't know what the boy was thinking. Fish McGonagall. Professor McGonagall's roar shook the chandeliers in the auditorium. She waved her wand through clenched teeth and the tables, chairs, and benches around her turned into all sorts of animals, large and small, and pounced on Fish. Seeing the animals pouncing on all sides, Fish had no way to escape, so he reverted to his cat form and took the initiative to fight them off. The great dining hall was filled with meowing dogs and cats, and fur flew everywhere, and every now and then some of the sizable animals were knocked over by fish and fell to the floor and became tables and chairs. The young magicians were dazzled and amazed by the spectacle. No wonder Professor McGonagall always catches us. Our pranks are nothing compared to Fish's. In Gryffindor House, George Weasley sighed sympathetically and his twin brother Fred nodded his head in approval. Although Fish was much stronger than ordinary cats, he had too many opponents, and even if the shape-shifting animals were killed and rendered unconscious, they would quickly rejoin the fray as new animals under Professor McGonagall's spells. So, after a fierce fight, Fish was pinned to the ground, unable to move, by a group of fake animals. Professor McGonagall walked over to Fish, pushed the dummies away, bent down, and lifted him by the back of the neck. Meow! Fish opened his mouth, hooked his paws around the Sorting Hat and took it to Professor McGonagall with a pleasant purr. Professor McGonagall, who was used to this by now, merely held Fish in her hand and, with a wave of her wand, returned the animals to their original form and put the Sorting Hat back on the four-legged stool. Now, back to your places. The students around the auditorium hurried back to their tables, and the new students resumed their positions next to Professor McGonagall. Having seen what Professor McGonagall could do, no young wizard dared to disobey her. The new students didn't even dare to speak, let alone whisper, and listened in silence as the Sorting Hat finished its song. Through the Sorting Hat's lyrics, the first-year students also understood what was going on at the sorting ceremony, couldn't help but sigh in relief, and followed the others to applaud the Sorting Hat's song. After the clapping stopped, Professor McGonagall finally released Fish, shooting her a warning look before taking a few steps forward and pulling a roll of parchment from her robes. Whatever name you call now will sit on the stool, put on the hat, and wait for sorting. Professor McGonagall opened the parchment, looked at the list and said, Hannah Abbott. Chapter 23, Fish Classification. Freshman after freshman came forward to put on the sorting hat and be sorted into different houses. But none of this mattered to Fish, who was happily lying at Professor McGonagall's feet in his cat form, squinting and napping, flicking his ears and tail from time to time, looking perfectly comfortable. As for the tattered sorting hat, Fish hadn't given it up, but after trying, it was clear that he wasn't able to snatch it under Minerva's care, so Fish was going to have to find another way. For now, he would have to do as he was told. Cats could be very patient when it came to hunting. Lifting his eyes and looking up at the sorting hat that was assigning the little wizards to different houses, Fish continued to lie quietly at Professor McGonagall's feet, but with his tail wagging restlessly. Professor McGonagall's eyes lingered on Fish's tail for a moment, knowing that the little boy hadn't given up yet, but now was not the time to lecture him, so she withdrew her gaze and continued to call out the names on the parchment. Harry Potter looked down at Professor McGonagall's feet with a look of envy at Fish, and as time went on, a lot of unnecessary worries arose in his mind. What if they were wrong, that he might not be a wizard, or that his talent as a wizard was so poor that none of the four houses were going to accept him, and that eventually the sorting hat would send him back? Such confusing thoughts were churning in Harry's mind that they made him so nervous he wanted to vomit. However, Harry had completely forgotten about the special reactions of the other wizards when he encountered them, and the magical effects that occurred when he held his own wand. Draco Malfoy. Between Harry's nervousness and Fish's leisure, finally reaching the surname that began with M, Malfoy strode steadily over to the four-legged stool and grabbed the sorting hat, which almost immediately touched his head as he shouted, Slytherin. Malfoy put down the sorting hat with satisfaction and walked over to the long table that belonged to Slytherin. Immediately after, Professor McGonagall knelt down and tapped Fish, who was still sound asleep at her feet. Fish McGonagall. Meow. Fish raised his head and looked at Professor McGonagall with a confused look. He hadn't heard the sorting hat song. It's your turn, go and put on the sorting hat, Professor McGonagall said to Fish, pointing to the hat on the four-legged stool. Meow. Fish bounced on the floor, turned into a human and asked excitedly, Are you going to give me this hat? No. I'm only letting you wear it for a little while. Stop messing with me, said Professor McGonagall. Hey, that's boring. Fish pouted, reached over and picked up the sorting hat, but didn't rush to put it on his head. Instead, he peeled back the slit of the twig hat that served as his mouth and stuck his head inside. No teeth, hey? How are you going to eat? I'm just a hat, I don't need to eat. Although the mouth had opened, that didn't stop the twig hat from talking. Is that so? Then you are so pitiful. Fish shook his head. It seemed to him that not being able to eat was so miserable. Put your hat on, urged Professor McGonagall, fearing that Fish was up to no good. But Fish didn't do as he was told, but put his twig hat back on the four-legged stool, mouth up, and jumped onto it, turning into a kitten and burrowing into it. Purr, Fish adjusted his body inside the hat and purred in satisfaction, now even more determined to get the hat. Hey, little guy! I'm not a cat's nest, the Sorting Hat, pinned down by Fish, growled angrily. Of course, Fish ignored him. Meow, Fish felt a squeeze on the back of his neck and then someone picked him up, followed by Minerva's stern face. Meow, not daring to provoke Professor McGonagall any further, Fish twisted and turned into his human form and dropped to the ground. Then, without being told, he picked up the Sorting Hat that was next to him and put it on his head, sitting down on the four-legged stool. The huge hat covered half of Fish's head, and with that, a small voice came out, "Let me see." Extraordinary courage. There is no doubt about it, no little wizard has ever dared to steal me from the hands of a group of teachers at the selection ceremony like you. You have a strong curiosity, your talent is not weak, your pride comes from deep inside you, you are also good at using your own advantages, you can do whatever it takes when necessary. Interesting, very interesting. So, where should I assign you? Said the Sorting Hat. Meow. Isn't it up to me to choose which house I want to go to? Fish asked aloud, without much thought. Of course, Hogwarts respects every student's wishes, my words are just a guide, so do you have a favorite house? The Sorting Hat continued to speak in Fish's ear in a small voice that no one else could hear. I'm interested in all the houses except the one with the big cat with lots of hair around its head, Fish continued to reply with a wide grin, not seeing Professor McGonagall's face behind him, instantly shadowed at his words. Are you sure? The twig cap merely dropped his voice and spoke to Fish as well, you know, Professor McGonagall is the head of Gryffindor. But, said Fish reluctantly with a little grimace, that big cat can't even climb a tree, he feels stupid. Through that strange box called a television, Fish had seen many different kinds of kindred spirits, of which the lion was the most useless at climbing trees, so he didn't think much of the big cat. At this, the faces of all the Gryffindors darkened, while the Slytherins were all smiles. Fish kept pointing at the Gryffindor banner, I prefer the big spotted cats, they're much more agile than these. The twig hat was probably the first time he had heard such an interesting reason. Well then, which of the remaining 3 houses do you prefer? The big rat first, Fish said after a moment's thought with his head cocked to one side, there's a big rat that looks like it, and farts badly. After Gryffindor, Professor Sprout and the Hufflepuff students blanched in unison. But Fish, who was blinded by his hat, didn't see it, and if he had he wouldn't have cared. Snakes and birds are good, Fish said, licking his lips, I like to eat them, and they're a challenge to hunt. Now even the professors and students in the other 2 houses couldn't help but blanch. Wait. The Sorting Hat reacted at that moment, so you like these 3 houses because you like to eat their representative animals? Yes, Fish replied matter-of-factly, don't all the restaurants out there put up signs with the food they sell? Fish thought he had understood correctly. Hogwarts is not a restaurant, the Sorting Hat felt it necessary to clarify to the young wizard, these represent animals as an honor to the 4 houses. A stupid cat that can't climb trees and 3 kinds of food. What's so glorious about that? Muttered Fish in a voice that could be heard by everyone in the great dining hall. Well, even if you have offended all 4 houses, there is still one to choose. The Sorting Hat sensed that if the conversation continued, no house would accept this little boy, so he ended the subject decisively and urged. Meow. So the big cat, at least he's not in my repertoire, Fish said reluctantly after a moment's consideration, the lion was at least half a kindred spirit compared to joining the food houses, if a bit dumber. So Gryffindor. The Sorting Hat shouted. Chapter 24, Dinner. Fish was probably the only student in Hogwarts history who did not receive an immediate welcome after sorting. Luckily for him, his plight was passed on by word of mouth among the students and, along with his animal affinity working on all creatures, after a few moments of indifference, the Gryffindor students, led by some of the first witches to come to their senses, cheered and welcomed Fish. But Fish didn't care about that, he strutted over to the long Gryffindor table and sat down, tapping the table as if no one was watching. Where's dinner? I thought there would be food after the ceremony. You lied to me again, Minerva. Professor McGonagall pretended not to hear him and continued announcing the names of the students. At the Gryffindor table, the Weasley twins approached Fish. Professor McGonagall doesn't fool you, our dear McGonagall. Fred reached out to grab Fish's shoulder, but Fish avoided him and, unamused, continued to approach Fish, explaining with a smile, Dinner won't start until after the last students are sorted, so, if you don't mind, here are a few sweets to get you started. George pulled some candy out of his robe and handed it to Fish. He was about to reach out to take them when a slender hand came out of nowhere and snatched the candy out of George's hand. What are you trying to do to Fish? Alicia Spinnet folded her arms and glared at the twins, while her best friends, Angelina Johnson and Katie Bell, protected Fish. Listen Fish, at Hogwarts, never accept any gifts from the Weasley twins, Katie Bell warned the confused Fish with a serious look. You've heard us. These are ordinary sweets, the twins shouted, not having the courage to play tricks at the sorting ceremony. Of course, it was hard to tell if this was a prelude to future pranks. Humph, Spinnet didn't care if the twins were telling the truth or not, and joined the other girls in shutting them out. Don't worry about them, we've got food here too. The girls pulled all kinds of snacks out of their pockets and shoved them into Fish's arms, then tried to put their hands on his head, but Fish dodged them all. As he dodged the girls' claws, he grabbed the food and stuffed it into his mouth. His attention was distracted by the food and his head was finally touched by the persistent girls. Fortunately, they also knew how to contain themselves. After petting him twice, she took the initiative to withdraw her hand. So Fish didn't bother to resist later. Oh, how cute! He's really like a kitten. I wish Fish was a girl, so I could sleep with him at night. The Gryffindor witches were so excited after petting Fish that the other witches were envious and jealous. The Gryffindor boys were also envious, only their envy was directed at Fish, who was surrounded by girls. George, do you think it's too late for me to practice the animagus spell? Seeing the girl he liked keep leaning towards Fish, Fred felt bitter. Even though he knew Angelina wasn't really in love with Fish, Fred still felt like he ate a lemon. George, who also had a crush on Angelina, looked at his brother blankly and was in no mood to answer that stupid question. The boys' distress didn't last long as Professor McGonagall called out Harry Potter's name and, apart from a few young witches from entirely Muggle families who kept huddling around Fish, most of the young wizards turned their attention to Harry who had the sorting hat on. Under everyone's eyes, the sorting hat remained silent for a moment before shouting, Gryffindor. After a brief silence, the auditorium erupted with excitement, especially Gryffindor. The Weasley twins forgot their sorrows for a moment and shouted, We got Potter! We got Potter! Percy, the head of Gryffindor, stood up excitedly, leaping toward Harry and clasping his hands together as if at a leaders' meeting. The huge movement caused Fish, who was immersed in food, to raise his head. He looked at Harry, who was surrounded by a group of boys, confused. He didn't understand why the group of humans was excited, and continued to sink into the food in his hand. Mia. The Gryffindor witches, after their excitement, regrouped around Fish. After all, the savior was too far away from them and it was better to play with the cat. After Harry, only 3 young wizards remained, and they were soon assigned to their respective houses. Professor McGonagall rolled up her parchment, picked up the sorting hat, and sat back down at the long teacher's table. Albus Dumbledore stood, arms outstretched, and said, Welcome to the start of the new academic year at Hogwarts. Before the party begins, I would like to say a few words. And that is, nippers, whiners, trinkets, pinchers. Thank you all. With those bewildering words, he sat back down and then all kinds of food appeared on everyone's table. Meow, Fish really preferred meat to snacks, and with a joyful shout, he picked up a roast chicken in front of him and gobbled it down with gusto. Halfway through the roast chicken, Fish remembered to use the cutlery and glanced cautiously in Professor McGonagall's direction, only to see her looking at him angrily, but making no other move. Could it be that Minerva is in no condition to give me lessons at the moment? Fish blinked, smiled at Professor McGonagall and continued nibbling, then provocatively licked his hands in front of Professor McGonagall, but after a couple of licks, he returned to his cat form and sat down on the long table to lick his fur. This, of course, made the little witches squeal. Professor McGonagall jumped up and tried to teach Fish a lesson, the overly excited little bastard, but Dumbledore stopped her. Leave him alone tonight, Minerva, Dumbledore said cheerfully, watching Fish run back and forth across the long table in Gryffindor, being fed by the others. It's best not to be too serious during banquet time. Seeing that Dumbledore had spoken, Professor McGonagall could only look at Fish, who was spilling her guts all over the Gryffindor table, and resumed her seat, cutting the lamb chops on her plate with a squeak. In fact, Fish had been keeping an eye on Professor McGonagall, and when he saw that she had been stopped by Dumbledore, he became even more unrestrained. Meow. Fish jumped around the group's plates, taking a bite of whatever food he saw and then pouncing on the next one. Instead of getting angry at being stolen by Fish, the young wizard seemed proud of himself and shouted cheerfully to his friend, "Fish likes my food." After pacing the long Gryffindor table back and forth 2 or 3 times, Fish had had enough, snatched a top hat off a young wizard's head, and lay down to sleep. As for the end of the dinner, what with that mean old Dumbledore's speech and the singing of the school song and all? What's that got to do with a kitten? Chapter 25, Scabbers. It wasn't until the song ended that Fish, who had been sleeping soundly, was called by the little witch beside him. "Fish, it's time to go back to the bedroom," Alicia Spinnet called in a soft voice, afraid to startle Fish. "Have you ever seen such a kind Alicia?" Not far away, Oliver Wood nudged Lee Jordan. "Never," Lee Jordan replied firmly, followed by another groan from the boys. "Meow." Fish lifted his head from his front paws and looked questioningly at the girl in front of him. "Go back to your bedroom if you want to sleep, you'll catch a cold in here," Spinnet continued in a low voice. "Is it over? Can I go home now?" Fish, who had no idea what a bedroom was, jumped off the table, took his human form and ran back to the hut where he had been living. He was then stopped by Percy, who couldn't laugh or cry. "Hogwarts is a boarding school, we should go back to our dorms and rest now." "Meow? What does boarding school mean? And what's a dormitory?" asked Fish, blinking and looking puzzled. Only after Percy and the surrounding witches explained the details did Fish understand. "So this is where I'll be living? Why haven't I heard about that? Minerva! You lied to me again," Fish snorted, glancing towards the teacher's table, only to find that Professor McGonagall had disappeared. Meow. Minerva is a big liar. It wasn't a big deal for Fish to change where he sleeps. Unlike ordinary cats, he didn't get too attached to his territory and didn't get nervous about strange places. He was just angry that Professor McGonagall was cheating him again. Professor McGonagall has a lot of credibility in Gryffindor, and at Hogwarts in general, not to mention the fact that she just showed off her dazzling shape-shifting abilities. So the Gryffindors looked at each other and decided to ignore Fish's complaints. "The Gryffindor dorms are very nice, I think you'll like them, and there will be other people living there with you, much more than if you lived alone." As prefect, Percy felt the need to defend his head of house's authority, and reassured Fish pleasantly. "The others? Are we going to fight to decide who owns the territory?" Fish's mood lifted and his hands twitched twice, as if he was interested in the matter. "No, no, no." Percy waved his hand. "The school has arranged for you to have your own bunks, there's no need to fight, and if you're not happy with your bunk, I'm sure your housemates will be happy to change it." Having seen the earlier encounter between Professor McGonagall and Fish, Percy himself wasn't sure he could beat the little man in front of him, let alone the other freshmen. Wiping the sweat from his head, Percy didn't want to pursue the subject any further and said, "Anyway, you can follow me and see." The new students swirled around Fish and Harry, following Percy through the Hogwarts castle, through hidden doors and up several changing staircases. Good thing there were plenty of little witches chatting with Fish along the way, and he didn't get bored seeing a lot of new things. After Percy shooed Peeves away, the group finally reached the Gryffindor dormitory. It was a hallway with no doors and a portrait of the fat lady hanging at the end. "Password?" asked the fat lady from the portrait. "Dragon scum," said Percy, and the portrait moved aside, revealing the circular hole behind it. The new students, led by Percy, stepped through the hole in the wall and into the Gryffindor common room. "The entrance to the girls' dormitory is that way." Percy pointed to a door a short distance away and the witches bid Fish good night before leaving, while Fish and the others were led through another door and up a spiral staircase to their bunks. Harry and the others finally had time to talk to Fish, but despite their intentions, they merely said hello and introduced themselves before changing into their pajamas and getting ready for bed. It had been an exhausting day. Fish, a creature of the night, was at his most energetic at this hour. He came up behind Ron Weasley quietly, his green eyes fixed on Ron. There was something good about this redhead. Fish smelled prey on Ron, and even though he was full, he wouldn't mind a workout after dinner. "Ow!" Ron turned his head without realizing it and saw a pair of green eyes staring at him in the dark bedroom, so he was startled. Startled, Ron took a step back, only to trip over his robes and fall to the floor. Harry and the others were taken back by the noise he made. "Don't look at me like that, it's scary," Ron grumbled as he rubbed his butt and picked himself up off the floor. "You smell like a rat." Instead of listening, Fish leaned closer, looking at the faintly twitching pocket on Ron's chest. Scabbers is my pet. You can't eat him. Ron was stunned for a moment, then panicked and covered his chest pocket, turning to the side to protect himself from the creepy sight of Fish, who had affection for Scabbers, even if he was his brother's unwanted pet. It was clear, however, that the willful Fish was beyond the reach of a young wizard like Ron, whose small hand reached down like a viper and clawed at Ron's breast pocket. Squeal! Oh, my God! Sensing danger, Scabbers fled from Ron's pocket, landing on the ground and hurtling toward the corner. Meow! Don't run! Fish transformed back into his cat form and chased him without hesitation. Cat and Mouse chased each other around the bedroom, messing up everyone's luggage and blanket. Scabbers! In the end, Scabbers couldn't escape Fish's chase and was pinned under his paws, struggling frantically. The fat mouse was quite strong, but not beyond the strength of a normal mouse, and since Fish himself was no ordinary cat, he was able to hold him down. Please, Fish, let go of Scabbers! Pleaded Ron loudly as he saw Scabbers in Fish's clutches. Meow! Fish cocked his head toward Ron and released his paws. Scabbers ran towards Ron, but after 2 steps he felt a pain in his tail and was pushed back by Fish. After pulling Scabbers backwards, Fish let go again and, when he got a few steps away, held him again. After a few times, Scabbers seemed to know that he couldn't escape, or that his strength was exhausted, so he just lay on the ground and let Fish give him a swat. When the mouse stopped playing with him, Fish lost interest in him. He wasn't hungry, and Fish understood the relationship between Scabbers and Ron. When he was wandering around outside, he had seen quite a few of the same type that had formed a similar relationship with humans, as well as dogs and owls. While it was rare for humans to have mice, it wasn't uncommon. Fish had pretended not to know, and so he was chasing the mouse leisurely. Now that he'd had enough, Fish naturally wouldn't eat Scabbers. No fun, meow. Returning to his human form, Fish tossed Scabbers to Ron and muttered to himself, still more fun to play with those owls. At that comment, Harry and the others, who had been watching the show, tensed.
Thanks for listening.